When the Western Empire fell in the year 476, the world seemed to hold its breath. Rome, the city that had once ruled all others, was silent. Her legions were gone, her emperors dethroned, her marble crumbling under ivy and time. But far to the east, beyond the blue sweep of the Aegean, another Rome still breathed. As we drift into tonight's story, whether you're here to rest, to unwind, or simply letting this play softly as you fall asleep, I'm really glad you're here. Tell me in the comments, what's one place in the world you'd love to see in person one day? If you find peace in calm history like this, a like or a subscribe helps this series reach more gentle minds who love Rome's story as much as you do. And quietly, almost everyone who listens, about 99%, isn't subscribed yet. If that's you, maybe take a moment to join us. It helps more than you'd imagine. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders relax, breathe slowly, and let's begin our journey. At the meeting place of continents, between Europe and Asia, there stood a city that would outlast empires. Built where sea and sky meet in shimmering silver, it rose upon 7 hills like a reflection of old Rome itself. Constantinople. To the Greeks it had once been Byzantium, a small trading port on the Bosporus, a narrow strait where the waters of the Black Sea meet the calm of the Mediterranean. But when Emperor Constantine looked upon its harbors and golden light, he saw destiny written in stone and sea. He would build here a capital not merely for his empire, but for the centuries to come. A city between worlds, between faiths, between ages. In the year 330, he consecrated it as Nova Roma, New Rome. Yet no one called it that for long. The people named it after him, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine, and the name would live for over 1,000 years. Its position was perfect. To the north and south, deep waters guarded it. To the west, mighty walls curved across the peninsula like clasped hands. Trade routes from every direction converged there. Silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, gold from Africa, fur and amber from the northern forests. Ships filled its harbors, their masts crowding the horizon like a forest of sails. And within its gates, the noise of markets rose, the mingling voices of a dozen languages under the same rising sun. Constantine built his dream in marble and faith. He filled the city with statues, fountains, and colonnades, symbols of power and beauty reborn. At its heart stood the Forum of Constantine, a vast open circle crowned by a column so tall that its summit seemed to touch the clouds. Upon it stood the emperor himself, cast in bronze, a crown of rays upon his head, the image of Rome reborn beneath heaven's light. And beyond the Forum, stretching toward the sea, lay the great palace, its mosaic floors shimmering like the sea itself. From its terraces, the emperor could gaze out upon the hippodrome, where chariots thundered down the track in clouds of dust and glory. Crowds roared, banners of blue and green rippled in the wind, and for a moment the old spirit of Rome lived again, not in conquest, but in celebration. But there was something new in Rome. The gods of old had faded, their temples now churches. Crosses gleamed where eagles once flew. Bishops replaced priests, and the sound of prayer echoed through basilicas built with Roman skill but Christian heart. The empire had found a new faith, and in this faith, a new identity. Constantinople was not just the capital of an empire, it was the soul of a civilization learning to endure. Its walls, the legendary Theodosian walls, built a century later, would stand unbroken for nearly a millennium, defying every army that came against them. Behind those stones, emperors ruled who still called themselves Caesar, still spoke of the Senate and people of Rome, still carried the title Augustus. To the men and women of this new world, they were not Byzantines. They were Romans, the last Romans. The streets glowed with white marble and gold leaf. Fountains murmured in shaded courtyards. In the mornings, merchants opened their stalls beside the Mese, the great central avenue, while scholars debated philosophy under colonnades that smelled faintly of incense and sea salt. Even as the Western world fell to silence, this city hummed with life. At night, the Bosporus shimmered with lanterns. Ships drifted across the dark water, their sails pale against the moonlight. From every tower came the sound of bells, marking the hours of prayer. And on the wind, faint but steady, came the call of the waves, as if the sea itself were whispering to the city it guarded. Whoever holds Constantinople, said an old saying, holds the key to the world. For centuries that proved true. When kings rose and fell in the west, Constantinople endured. When barbarians swept across Europe, its walls stood firm. It became the lighthouse of civilization, the keeper of knowledge, art, and faith through the long twilight that followed Rome's fall. To travelers arriving by ship, the first sight of the city was said to steal one's breath. Its domes caught the morning light in gold and rose. The sea reflected its towers as though even the water wished to remember them. And high above all stood the banners of empire, crimson and gold against a boundless sky. It was a city of both strength and grace, a place where the legacy of Rome and the spirit of faith walked side by side, a bridge between what had been and what was still to come. In the east, wrote one traveler, the sun rises twice, once from the sea and once from the domes of Constantinople. And as the world beyond its walls changed, this city, this living memory of Rome, prepared to shape a new age of its own. In the centuries after the fall of the West, the Eastern Empire stood as a paradox, at once ancient and new, humble and magnificent, fragile yet enduring. Its people lived not in the shadow of Rome, but in its afterglow, a light still warm, though the fire that once fed it had long since gone out. To the world beyond its walls, the name Byzantium would come later, whispered by later historians. But to the men and women who lived within its marble streets, there was no such distinction. They were Romans. Their empire was Rome, and their emperor, Basilius Romaean, was the heir of Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine alike. The empire they inherited was no longer ruled by the legions that had once spanned continents. Its power rested now in parchment and law, in words, not swords. The armies still marched, yes, but their victories were tempered by diplomacy, by gold, and by patience. For the East had learned what the West never did, that an empire can survive longer by endurance than by expansion. The emperors of Constantinople ruled through ceremony as much as command. Every gesture in the palace carried meaning. Every robe, every ritual, every word spoken in the great halls of the Chrysotriklinos, the golden throne room. When the emperor appeared before his court, he did so beneath mosaics of heaven, Christ enthroned above, angels surrounding him, and the ruler of men below, a reflection of divine order on earth. To the watching crowds, it was a vision of eternity, the idea that as long as the emperor stood, the world itself remained whole. That was the unbroken faith of Romanitas, the belief that Rome was not a place, but a principle, the embodiment of order in a world forever threatened by chaos. In Constantinople's libraries, scholars guarded this inheritance. They copied the works of Plato and Aristotle, the histories of Herodotus and Livy, the letters of Cicero, and the codes of Roman law. Their lamps burned through the night as they preserved the memory of a civilization the West had begun to forget. One scholar wrote, "We keep the flame, for others will need its light." And so they did. When Europe slept through centuries of darkness, Byzantium's scribes kept its memory alive, quietly, patiently, line by line. Their language shifted from Latin to Greek, but the heartbeat remained Roman. Taxes were levied as they had been under the Caesars. Citizens served under Roman titles, praetors, tribunes, consuls. The law courts still quoted the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great body of Roman law that would later inspire the statutes of Europe. Even the emperor's face on the coinage bore the Latin inscription, Dominus Noster, Our Lord. And beyond the walls, the empire's provinces still echoed with old rhythms. In Antioch, artisans crafted mosaics of gods now renamed as saints. In Alexandria, scholars debated theology in the same halls where the philosophers of old had once spoken. In Thessalonica, farmers plowed the same fields their grandfathers had under Rome's eagle. The empire lived on, not through conquest, but through habit, through continuity, quiet and enduring. To those who looked westward, to the broken provinces once ruled from the Tiber, Byzantium seemed like a miracle. A city of light surrounded by storms, a last bastion of reason in a world remade by warlords and tribes. Kings from afar sent envoys to her gates, seeking recognition, trade, or blessing. Even in decline, the Eastern Emperor was seen as the rightful heir of civilization itself. The Western kings called themselves Rex, Duke, Count, but none dared call themselves emperor without Constantinople's approval. Even the great Charlemagne, when crowned by the Pope in the year 800, felt the tremor of contradiction, for there already was an emperor reigning across the sea. It was a strange world, one where the shadow of Rome stretched farther than its armies ever could. Within the walls of Constantinople, life unfolded with ritual grace. Each day, processions wound through the streets, incense rising, banners fluttering, choirs singing hymns in Greek that filled the air with gold and sorrow. Merchants opened their stalls beside the Meza, the great boulevard that cut through the city's heart, while nobles in silken robes rode past in gilded carriages, the horses' hooves striking marble like distant drums. And always, above it all, the domes gleamed. In those domes was the soul of Byzantium, round, celestial, unbroken, each one a symbol of eternity held in stone. To step into one of their churches was to step into heaven. The scent of oil and incense hung in the air, candles flickered like stars, and mosaics of saints shimmered in the lamplight, tiny pieces of colored glass capturing divine radiance. They called their worship orthodoxia, the right belief, the straight path, and within it they found both peace and power. Faith, more than force, now bound the empire together. The emperor ruled by divine right, not merely as Caesar, but as God's chosen steward on earth. Every victory was his will, every defeat a test. To the people, the empire was more than government, it was a mirror of heaven itself. And so long as it endured, the world was still in balance. Yet beneath that calm surface, tensions stirred. Greek thinkers and Roman administrators sometimes clashed. Generals from the provinces whispered of rebellion. New faiths and rival powers rose at the empire's edges. Persia in the east, Slavic tribes in the north, the Arabs soon to come from the south. But within the golden walls, life moved in its measured rhythm, certain that time itself revolved around this city. For centuries, the emperors of Constantinople ruled with both intelligence and restraint. They fought wars when they must, negotiated when they could, and trusted in their walls when neither sufficed. They outlasted enemies not by crushing them, but by waiting them out, like a mountain enduring wind and rain. And when new generations were born, they grew up never doubting that theirs was the true and eternal Rome. To them, the fall of the West was a tragedy, but also a warning. An empire dies not from defeat, but from forgetting what it is. And so they remembered. We are Romans, they said. Not because we were born in Rome, but because Rome is born in us. In that belief they found their strength, for as long as the Eastern Empire held that faith, in its order, its duty, its sacred continuity, it would endure storms that would have shattered any other realm. The centuries ahead would test that endurance, through fire, through plague, through war and faith alike. But for now, Constantinople stood untouched, the shining city by the sea, the living memory of a world that refused to die. In the East, one poet wrote, the Romans have not fallen. They have simply changed the color of their light. Constantinople was not merely the heir of Rome's power, but the vessel of its transformation. In this city, empire became devotion and politics became ritual. Where the West had fallen into the clangor of swords, the East built cathedrals that reached toward heaven. And in their golden domes, the old world was reborn, not in conquest, but in faith. To walk through the city in the 5th and 6th centuries was to walk through a mosaic of belief. Every surface shimmered, marble, porphyry, and gold. Walls were inlaid with precious stone, streets paved in smooth slabs of white, fountains sang softly in the courtyards of churches where the air smelled of wax and incense. Light itself seemed alive there, refracted through smoke and glass into a gentle, perpetual dawn. This was a world remade through devotion. Rome had built its greatness upon law and legion. Constantinople built its eternity upon faith and form. And nowhere was this fusion of heaven and earth more complete than in its greatest monument, the Hagia Sophia. When the Emperor Justinian I rose to the throne in the year 527, he inherited an empire vast but restless, an inheritance of contradictions. The people longed for peace, the church longed for purity, and Justinian himself longed for immortality. He dreamed of a Rome restored in glory, united in belief, and bound together by divine law. And to symbolize that dream, he would raise a temple the likes of which the world had never seen. The old basilica of the same name, the Church of Holy Wisdom, had been destroyed in the riots that tore through Constantinople years before. The city was scarred, uncertain, divided by politics and faith alike. But Justinian saw an opportunity in its ruins. He summoned architects from across the empire, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians and visionaries both, and gave them a single, impossible command: make me a church worthy of heaven. For 5 years they built it. Stone by stone, dome by dome, they raised a structure so vast and delicate that even those who helped create it doubted it could stand. When it was complete, Justinian himself stood beneath its great central dome, 180 feet above the marble floor, and whispered words that would echo through history. Solomon, I have surpassed thee. The Hagia Sophia was more than a church. It was a statement of power, of devotion, of continuity. Its dome seemed to float upon air, ringed by 40 windows that poured sunlight down like liquid gold. Mosaics of angels shimmered in the apse, their wings outstretched, their faces serene. The marble beneath glowed with veins of green and rose, quarried from every corner of the empire, a patchwork of its vastness made of stone. And when choirs sang, the sound rolled through the space like a tide, echoing into eternity. To stand within those walls was to feel the fusion of two worlds, Rome's reason and faith's mystery. It was geometry turned into worship, and architecture made into prayer. No army could have conquered hearts as surely as this place did. Outside its doors, the city mirrored that same transformation. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter and Mars became churches to the Virgin and the saints. The Roman calendar now turned on the rhythm of Christian feasts. Even the Senate met beneath the sign of the cross. Yet in every column, every arch, one could still sense the echo of the older world. The precision, the symmetry, the quiet insistence on order that had always been Rome's true gift. Justinian's reign was an age of grand ambition. He reformed the laws of the empire into a single monumental code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a distillation of centuries of Roman wisdom that would later guide kings and parliaments long after the empire itself was dust. He sent generals to reclaim the lost provinces of the West, Africa, Italy, even parts of Spain. For a moment it seemed that the old dream had returned, Rome united, Rome eternal. But the world had changed, and the cost of that dream was high. Wars bled the treasury, plagues swept through the cities, earthquakes shook the very walls of the Hagia Sophia. And yet, through it all, the empire endured, not by conquest but by faith. The people of Constantinople saw in their emperor not merely a ruler, but the earthly reflection of divine will. And in their city, its gold, its ritual, its music, they found assurance that heaven still watched over them. Byzantium was a world where art and prayer were the same act. A single mosaic might take decades, every piece of glass cut by hand, placed with devotion, polished until it caught even the faintest candlelight. Icons, paintings of Christ, Mary, and the saints, were not just art, they were windows into eternity. When believers prayed before them, they did not imagine speaking to paint and wood, but to the divine presence that shimmered just beyond it. The empire's artisans became theologians in pigment and stone. They invented a visual language of stillness, calm faces, elongated hands, golden backgrounds that dissolved the sense of time. Where Roman sculpture had sought to capture the human form, Byzantine art sought to reveal the soul. Each figure seemed to exist outside the world, yet fully within it, as if glimpsed through a veil. In this way, Constantinople became more than a city. It became a vision of heaven made tangible. Pilgrims who entered its gates often wrote that they could no longer tell whether they stood upon earth or in paradise. Even visitors from distant lands, Persians, Slavs, Franks, left awestruck. The light, they said, did not shine in the city. It glowed. When we saw their worship, wrote envoys from Kiev and Rus centuries later, we no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth. That was the gift of Byzantium, the ability to make eternity visible, not in words, but in form. And so, even as wars came and empires rose and fell around her, Constantinople remained serene, a sanctuary where faith and beauty met. But beneath the gold and incense, the seeds of future storms already stirred. The church that once united the empire would one day divide it. East and West would quarrel, and the faith that had once bound them would fracture. Icons, once venerated, would become points of rage and reform. Yet through every upheaval, the art and spirit of Byzantium would whisper the same truth, that even in change, the divine endures. For now, though, the city rested in its glory, a world reborn, luminous and whole. From its harbor to its hills, from its domes to its walls, it stood as the promise of civilization remade, a bridge between the fading Rome of memory and the eternal heaven it aspired to reflect. "Here," wrote a pilgrim, gazing at the Hagia Sophia, "the earth itself has learned how to sing." The 6th century dawned over a weary but luminous world. The Western Empire was long gone, remembered only in legend. Yet in Constantinople, that glittering city by the Bosporus, an emperor rose who dared to dream that Rome might live again. His name was Justinian. He was not born to power. He came from the rough lands of Illyria, from a family of peasants, the kind who once worked the soil beneath the legion's boots. But fate and ambition lifted him. His uncle, Justin, rose through the army ranks to become emperor, and through him, the young Justinian found a doorway into destiny. From the beginning, he was different. He studied late into the night, memorizing scripture, philosophy, and the old Roman law. He saw no boundary between faith and rule. To him, the empire was not merely a state, but a sacred instrument of divine purpose. And when he inherited the throne in 527 CE, he set out to forge a new kind of empire, one that was both Roman in discipline and Christian in soul. Justinian's mind was vast, part administrator, part theologian, part dreamer. He sought not just to govern his world, but to perfect it. He envisioned an empire purified of corruption, united under one law, one faith, one emperor, an earthly reflection of heaven's order. His days began before sunrise. Each morning he prayed with his clergy, then dictated laws, judged disputes, met ambassadors, and supervised the construction of buildings that would shape the skyline of history. And beside him, always, was Theodora, his empress and equal. Theodora's story was as remarkable as his. Born into poverty, once an actress and performer, she rose through wit and resilience to become Justinian's partner in rule. She was sharp-tongued, fearless, and compassionate, a woman of strength wrapped in poise. Together, they formed one of history's most extraordinary alliances. He, the mind of empire, she, its heart. While Justinian dreamed in marble and law, Theodora saw the souls of those forgotten by both, the poor, the widowed, the outcast. She built homes for the destitute, founded convents for women who had nowhere else to turn, and influenced policies that softened the empire's hardest edges. When her enemies whispered of her past, she met their scorn with silence and brilliance. The emperor may have ruled from his throne, but it was Theodora's calm resolve that often held the empire together. Yet even as the imperial couple sought to rebuild paradise, their reign began in turmoil. In 532, Constantinople erupted in what history would call the Nika riots, one of the most violent uprisings the ancient world had ever seen. It began, as revolutions often do, in the heart of the people, in the Hippodrome. The city's factions, the blues and the greens, rivals born from the passion of chariot racing, had become something more than sports fans. They were political movements, social forces, voices of the streets. Resentment over taxes, corruption, and failed reforms had festered for years. When a public execution went wrong, and cries for mercy turned to chants of Nika, conquer, the city exploded. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. Palaces, markets, churches, all were set alight. The crowd demanded Justinian's abdication, calling for a new emperor. Many in the palace urged him to flee, but Theodora would not. Standing before the trembling court, she spoke words that turned despair into iron. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Royal purple makes a fine burial shroud. It was enough. Justinian stayed. He summoned his general Belisarius, a young commander of brilliance and loyalty, and ordered him to act. Under cover of negotiation, Belisarius marched his troops into the Hippodrome, where tens of thousands of rioters had gathered. Then came silence, followed by the clash of steel. When it was over, the city lay in ruins, and 30,000 souls were dead. Out of that devastation, Justinian began again. He would rebuild not just the city, but the empire's image of itself. The fires that destroyed Constantinople gave birth to its greatest monument, the new Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Within 5 years, it rose from the ashes, crowned by a dome so vast it seemed to float between earth and sky. When the emperor entered its completed halls, sunlight pouring through 40 windows in a ring of gold, he whispered the words that would outlive him. "Glory to God, who has judged me worthy to accomplish such a work. Solomon, I have surpassed thee." The Hagia Sophia became the symbol of his reign, a vision of divine order rendered in stone. Its light filled the city, its dome mirrored heaven. To his people, it was proof that Rome's spirit, refined, sanctified, eternal, still lived. But Justinian's dreams were not confined to marble. He turned his gaze outward, toward the lands once ruled by Caesar and Augustus. If God had granted him this throne, he believed, it was to restore the empire's lost unity. And so, under the banners of the cross and the eagle, his generals marched west. Belisarius led the charge, first to North Africa, where the Vandals had built a kingdom on Rome's ruins. In a lightning campaign, he reclaimed Carthage, the ancient rival of Rome, and the cities cheered once more under imperial banners. Then came Italy, and the long war against the Goths. Through victory and siege, famine and plague, the eastern armies brought back the ghost of the West, piece by fragile piece. For a moment it seemed Justinian's dream had come true. The Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, our sea, was once again an imperial lake. Coins bearing his image circulated from Spain to Syria, Africa to the Alps. Rome had been reborn, but the dream came at a cost. War drained the treasury, fields went untended, cities emptied, their people carried off by a new terror, a plague that swept through the empire like a shadow. Still, Justinian pressed on, tireless and absolute. He oversaw the creation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great codification of Roman law, gathering, refining, and immortalizing centuries of wisdom into a single, luminous text. It would become the cornerstone of Western justice for 1,000 years, a law not just of empire, but of civilization itself. And through it all, Theodora remained his compass. Even as illness struck her, even as the plague darkened the city, she guided him with clarity and courage. When she died, Justinian was never quite the same. He ruled for decades more, but those who saw him near the end said the fire in his eyes had softened, the dream still alive, but gentler now, touched by grief. He built, wrote one chronicler, as if he would live forever. And in a way he did. For the empire he shaped, in stone, in law, in spirit, would echo through centuries. The domes he raised would inspire cathedrals and mosques alike. The laws he wrote would govern nations unborn. And the dream that guided him, that Rome could live again, purified and eternal, would never truly fade. For all his vision, Justinian ruled a world balanced upon a fragile light. The empire he rebuilt glowed with marble and gold, yet beneath that radiance, shadows gathered, storms that would test the faith of emperor and people alike. It began, as calamities often do, without warning. In the year 541, a strange sickness appeared in the harbors of Egypt, a place of wind and trade, where ships from every corner of the world met. No one knew its cause. They only knew that it spread as swiftly as the sea's own tide. Merchants carried it northward, through the Levant, across the Aegean, until at last it reached Constantinople. At first, the people whispered that it was a passing fever, but soon bodies began to fall in the markets, in the baths, in the very courtyards of the palace. The city that had sung with bells and fountains now filled with the sound of mourning. They called it simply the plague. It came with fever, swelling, and delirium. Doctors and priests alike were powerless. Families locked themselves in their homes. The streets grew silent except for the creak of funeral carts. And when the carts overflowed, the dead were carried to the sea, or buried in pits outside the city walls, where the air itself seemed to tremble with sorrow. The chronicler Procopius, who lived through those days, wrote that 10,000 souls died each day at the height of the plague. The numbers were beyond counting. Even the emperor fell ill. For weeks Justinian lay between life and death, his fevered mind haunted by visions of judgment and eternity. When at last he recovered, the city he ruled was changed forever. The plague would return in waves for centuries, weakening the empire's strength, emptying its fields, and dimming its light. But in its wake, something quiet and enduring took root, a deeper humility, a sharper faith, and an understanding that all human grandeur is only borrowed from time. Yet the empire did not fall. It endured, as Byzantium always did, through patience, through adaptation, through the conviction that survival itself was a kind of grace. In the years that followed, fires swept through Constantinople. Lightning struck the dome of the Hagia Sophia, splitting its vault. Earthquakes shook the ground beneath the city's walls. But each time the people rebuilt. Each time they lit their candles and began again. There was a strength in this, not the strength of conquest, but of constancy. The same discipline that had once built legions now built resilience. In one homily, a priest stood before a trembling crowd and said, "The city burns, but the Spirit does not. For it was not we who built it, it was faith, and faith does not perish in flame." The people listened, and they believed. In the empire's great basilicas, mosaics of saints and angels shone more brightly than ever. Art became medicine, beauty became hope. Each new tragedy gave rise to new creation, as though the city itself were determined to turn every wound into gold. Even Justinian, scarred by loss, never yielded to despair. He rebuilt what the fires destroyed, restored what the earth had shaken, and ruled with a calm that seemed almost superhuman. Those who saw him in his later years described him as silent, solemn, yet radiant, a man who had looked upon ruin and found meaning in it. He turned his focus inward, toward what would last. His greatest triumphs of this period were not of war but of words, the codification of law, the foundation of order, the gathering of wisdom from ages past into a single body of truth. The corpus juris civilis, the body of civil law, was his answer to mortality. Where plague had taken bodies, the law would preserve civilization. To read it was to see the architecture of justice itself. Every statute, every decree, every fragment of reason drawn together like stones in a cathedral of thought. It was Rome's last and greatest gift to the world, shaped by a man who knew that all empires crumble, but that law, like faith, can endure beyond death. And still, through these trials, the Hagia Sophia stood. Its vast dome, though cracked by time and quake, remained alight with gold and song. When the sun rose through its high windows, it cast the light of morning like a blessing across the marble floor. In the stillness, one could almost forget the sorrow that lay beyond its walls. To enter that place in those years was to feel what the Byzantines called the peace of heaven upon earth. They believed the city itself, its streets, its walls, its very air, was a reflection of divine will. And though death had touched them all, their faith turned that loss into purpose. Procopius, ever the observer, wrote with wonder and melancholy, "The city has endured plague, fire, and trembling of the earth, yet she stands, and the people, though they have buried their world, still sing." It was true, for even in grief the city still glowed. The markets reopened, ships again filled the harbors, candles flickered in the windows of homes rebuilt from ashes, and at dusk, when the call of the muezzin had not yet been heard, and the world was still one faith, the sound of church bells drifted across the Bosporus like a memory of paradise. For Justinian and his people, survival itself had become sacred. They had learned that faith was not found in triumph, but in endurance, in the quiet courage to begin again after every ending. The plague had taught them humility. The fires had taught them renewal. The trembling of the earth had taught them trust. And through it all, the empire endured, scarred but living, weary but luminous. "We have been broken," wrote one bishop, "but not undone, for God refines gold by fire, and we are still shining." When Justinian died in 565 CE, the empire mourned him not only as a ruler, but as a symbol of perseverance, of faith, of Rome's undying spirit. His body was laid to rest beneath the dome of the Holy Apostles, where Constantine himself slept, and the bells of Constantinople rang for a man who had dreamed of eternity, and in his own way had found it. The city he left behind bore his mark in every stone, every law, every prayer. It had suffered, and it had survived, and in that survival it found the truest form of strength. "Empires fall," wrote a later poet, "but the light of faith cannot be buried, for even among ruins the soul remembers how to rise." When the bells of Constantinople fell silent after Justinian's death, an uneasy stillness settled over the empire. Outside the city's great walls, provinces were fading, some lost to enemies, others to time. The treasury was strained, the people weary, and yet something remarkable endured. His dream did not die, it simply changed form. For Justinian's truest monument was not the marble of his palaces, nor even the golden dome of Hagia Sophia, but the law he left behind. The corpus juris civilis, the body of civil law, became the invisible architecture of civilization itself. A cathedral built from words rather than stone. He had commanded his jurists, led by the brilliant Tribonian, to gather centuries of scattered decrees, legal opinions, and imperial edicts into a single ordered whole. What emerged was nothing less than a map of justice. 4 vast works: the Code, collecting the laws of the emperors past; the Digest, distilling the wisdom of Rome's greatest jurists, the Institutes, a textbook for future generations, and the Novellae, the new laws of Justinian's own time. It was clarity carved from chaos. For a world still haunted by uncertainty, this code offered order, not through the sword, but through structure. Within its pages, Rome's voice still spoke, the rule of law above the will of men, the protection of the innocent, the sanctity of property and promise, the belief that reason itself could be the foundation of peace. The Byzantines saw it not merely as legislation, but as revelation, a gift from God through the emperor, binding heaven's order to the earth. To them, Justinian had not only rebuilt the empire's walls, but its very mind. He gave us reason where there was confusion, one jurist wrote, and in so doing, he restored the empire's soul. And so, even as new storms gathered on the horizon, the empire's heartbeat continued in the rhythm of law and liturgy. Each generation studied his words, copied them, and built upon them. In monasteries and schools, young scholars learned to see in law what the Romans had always seen, a mirror of the cosmos, a harmony between justice and grace. It would take centuries for the full weight of this work to unfold. Long after Byzantium's banners faded from the shores of the Mediterranean, Justinian's code would re-emerge in the Latin schools of Italy, inspiring the foundations of European law, the canon law of the Church, and the constitutional ideas of nations yet unborn. The principles of contracts, rights, citizenship, even the idea that a ruler too must obey the law, all trace their ancestry to that vast and careful text written under the golden domes of Constantinople. The empire has passed away, wrote a scholar in the Middle Ages, but its laws still rule the world. In that sense, Justinian's dream succeeded more perfectly than he could ever have imagined. But law was only one part of his legacy. The other was beauty. The empire he left behind was a place where faith and form intertwined. Churches gleamed across the land, from Ravenna's quiet mosaics where saints gaze from fields of gold to the marble cities of Asia Minor, where domes mirrored the heavens. Art no longer sought to imitate life, but to transcend it, to reveal what was eternal within the fleeting. In this, Byzantium became the bridge between worlds. It preserved the wisdom of antiquity, Greek, Roman, and Eastern alike, and wrapped it in a spiritual light that would one day illuminate the Renaissance. Even as borders shifted and armies came and went, Constantinople remained a lighthouse for the mind. Its scholars translated Aristotle, Euclid, Galen. Its priests refined theology into art. Its architects perfected the balance of curve and light that would echo through every dome of Europe and beyond. The empire itself began to change. The Greek language, long the tongue of philosophy, now became the empire's own, replacing the Latin of its founders. The faith that once united it with Rome now began to draw it apart. In the West, new kingdoms rose beneath the cross of Latin Christendom. In the East, the Orthodox world blossomed under the vaults of Byzantium. Both traced their heritage to the same flame, but from this point onward, that flame would burn in two directions. Still, the Byzantines called themselves Romans. They wore the name like armor. And why not? Their emperors still ruled from a palace built by Constantine, still crowned beneath a cross of gold, still seated on a throne said to contain relics of the true cross itself. They were the keepers of memory, the guardians of 1,000 years. In the centuries after Justinian, his empire would shrink, expand, and transform. Plagues would return, invaders would press its borders, earthquakes would shake its foundations, and yet the rhythm he set endured. Law, faith, and beauty, three pillars that could not fall together. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing more than 1,000 years later, would describe Justinian's reign as the last bright morning of Rome, a moment when the empire, old and weary, shone with its full brilliance before the long afternoon of decline. But to the Byzantines themselves, it did not decline at all. It was revelation, the empire perfected, made holy through suffering. They called it the Basileia ton Romaeon, the empire of the Romans, not of conquest, but of order. And through the long centuries that followed, the world would look to Constantinople not only as a fortress of stone, but as a fortress of thought. The domes Justinian raised still crown the city's skyline today. The Hagia Sophia, rebuilt, repurposed, renamed, still catches the morning light, just as it did 1,500 years ago. Its dome, cracked yet unbroken, still floats above the Bosporus like a promise. And in that promise lies the echo of the emperor who once stood beneath it and whispered that he had surpassed Solomon. Perhaps he had, not in wealth, nor power, nor peace, but in endurance. For Solomon's temple is gone, Justinian still standing. Time erases the conqueror, a Byzantine poet wrote, but it remembers the builder. In law and in stone, Justinian built something that time could not erase. Through him, the Empire of Rome found its last perfect shape, not an empire of legions, but of light. And as centuries turned, as empires rose and fell in their own time, the Byzantines would still look up at that vast golden dome and remember, Rome's body may have perished, but its soul had learned how to live forever. By the 7th century, the empire that Justinian had rebuilt stood vast, yet stretched thin. Its marble cities gleamed, its laws ordered life with Roman precision, its faith united millions. But beyond its frontiers, new powers were rising, swift, hungry, and certain of their destiny. The first great test came from the east, from an empire as old as its own. Persia, the eternal rival of Rome, still held its dominion from Mesopotamia to the mountains of Iran. Its kings, the Sassanids, called themselves kings of kings, ruling through ceremony and divine right, mirroring Constantinople's splendor with their own. Between these two ancient worlds, the border was not a line, it was a living frontier, breathing tension and war. For generations, the Byzantines and Persians had fought not for land, but for supremacy itself, two mirrors reflecting power back and forth across the deserts and plains. At times, they traded peace for tribute. At others, they marched to the very edge of one another's capitals. Their wars were slow, grinding, empires testing endurance rather than ambition. In the early 600s, the balance broke. Persian armies, led by the fierce king Khosrow II, swept into Roman territory. They captured Syria, Egypt, and even reached the walls of Constantinople itself. The holy city of Jerusalem was taken, and with it, unthinkably, the relic of the true cross. To the people of Byzantium, it felt like the end of the world. The empire, worn thin by centuries of strain, seemed ready to collapse. But then, from within that exhaustion, rose one more savior. His name was Heraclius. Crowned in 610, he was not born into splendor. He was a soldier's emperor, pragmatic and resolute, a man who believed in destiny but trusted his own hands to shape it. When he took the throne, the empire's treasury was empty, its armies demoralized, its enemies at the gates. Many urged him to flee to Carthage and rule what remained from Africa. Instead, he stayed. For years, he fought a war not just of armies, but of endurance. He reformed taxes, rebuilt discipline, and led his soldiers in person, across mountains and frozen plains, through hardship beyond measure. And in 627, against all expectation, he struck deep into Persian lands and defeated Khosrow's armies in the snows near Nineveh. When he returned to Constantinople, he carried with him the relic of the true cross, and with it a renewed faith that the empire's story was not yet over. The people called him the new Constantine. The bells of Hagia Sophia rang for days. The city that had nearly fallen rejoiced as though reborn. But victory, though glorious, came at a terrible cost. Both empires, Byzantine and Persian alike, were exhausted, hollowed out, and vulnerable. And from the deserts of Arabia, a new force was already rising, one that would change the world forever. At first, few in Constantinople understood what was coming. Reports spoke of tribes united under a prophet, of armies moving with divine purpose. Within a few years, those reports became reality. The followers of Islam, inspired by faith and fire, began to move outward, first across Arabia, then into the lands that had for centuries been Rome's and Persia's battlefield. To the Byzantines, it must have seemed like a tide of wind and light, sudden, unstoppable, and certain. Damascus fell, then Jerusalem, then Egypt. The old Roman provinces that had once been the empire's richest jewels slipped away one by one. And soon the Mediterranean itself, once called Mare Nostrum, our sea, became a frontier once more. But Constantinople endured. In 674, the new Arab fleet swept up the Aegean, encircling the great city. For 5 years, siege and hunger threatened its people. And yet the city held, not by miracle alone, but by ingenuity. From the walls, Byzantine ships unleashed a weapon that seemed forged from legend itself, Greek fire. A blazing liquid that burned even upon water, it turned the sea into flame. The Arab fleet withdrew, and the city stood unbroken, a fortress of both faith and invention. When the sun rose the next morning, the smoke over the Bosporus curled like incense, and the bells rang once again. For the people of Constantinople, survival had become a liturgy. Every siege, every plague, every earthquake was met not with despair, but with prayer. They believed their city was chosen, protected by the Virgin herself, whose icon was carried along the walls during every assault. As long as she watched, the empire could not fall. To live in Byzantium in those years was to live in a world of constant threat and constant grace. Beyond the frontiers, the map of the world was changing, new caliphates rising, new faiths spreading, old kingdoms dissolving. But within the walls, time moved differently. The city still shone with candles and mosaics, its scholars still debated Aristotle, its priests still sang the same hymns that had echoed since Constantine's time. The empire was smaller now, its reach diminished, its borders drawn tight around the sea. But within that narrowing space, life deepened. The Byzantines became masters of survival, of diplomacy, of adaptation, of patience. They learned to outlast rather than overpower. They paid their enemies in gold when needed and in fire when forced. They shifted alliances like a river finding its way through stone, and through it all, they kept their faith. A new system emerged. Themes, regional military provinces governed by generals who could respond quickly to invasion. It was a structure born of necessity, but it gave the empire new life. For centuries to come, it would keep Byzantium alive when larger empires fell. "We are surrounded," one Byzantine chronicler wrote, "yet the circle is our shield." Indeed, Constantinople had become the still point of a turning world, an island of order in a sea of change. To the west, the old lands of Rome had become kingdoms ruled by Franks, Lombards, and Goths. To the east, the caliphs ruled from Damascus and Baghdad, and between them stood Byzantium, wounded, reduced, yet luminous. The city was a living contradiction, both fortress and sanctuary, both relic and revelation. From its harbors, ships still sailed, bringing silk from the east, furs from the north, gold from Africa. Its markets still hummed with life, its scholars still copied ancient texts, its children still played in the shadow of domes that had survived 100 wars. "The world turns," they said, "but Constantinople endures." In that endurance lay its genius. Where others sought glory in conquest, the Byzantines found it in survival, in keeping alive the flame that had once lit Rome. They no longer dreamed of ruling the world. They dreamed only of holding their light against the dark. "The empire has become the city," a monk wrote, "and the city has become the world." And so it was. In an age of storms, Byzantium became calm, a still heart beating within the centuries, carrying forward the memory of all that had come before. By the 8th century, the empire that had once seemed eternal was quieter now, smaller, enclosed, but still luminous. Its frontiers had stabilized. Its enemies pressed less closely. The old wars had faded into uneasy peace, and yet within its walls a new conflict began, one that would wound its spirit more deeply than any foreign invasion. It was not a war of armies, but of images, of color and faith, of what could and could not be seen. For centuries, Byzantium had expressed its devotion through art. Icons of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints filled every church, every home, every public square. They were more than paintings. They were windows into heaven. To look upon one was to stand in the presence of the divine. The faithful kissed them, lit candles before them, carried them into battle, and prayed through them for mercy and protection. In times of plague or siege, icons were paraded along the walls of Constantinople, the Virgin's image held high as both shield and blessing. To the Byzantines, these images were not idols, but instruments of love, a bridge between the seen and the unseen. But not all agreed. Some priests and emperors began to question whether these holy images had crossed a line, whether in venerating them, the people had drifted too close to worshiping the works of human hands. The first whispers came from the east, where the desert winds carried older suspicions of imagery. And in the year 726, Emperor Leo III, called the Isaurian, took the first decisive step. He ordered the removal of the icon of Christ that stood above the chalk gate, the bronze entrance to the imperial palace. To some, it was an act of purification, a return to a purer and visible faith. To others, it was desecration. The reaction was instant and fierce. In Constantinople, riots broke out. Monks and artisans who had painted the holy images resisted, some dying to protect the art they believed was sanctified by God himself. Across the empire, churches were divided, families too. In distant monasteries, the walls that had once glowed with the faces of saints were scraped bare, gold mosaics chipped away until only cold stone remained. This was the beginning of the iconoclast controversy, the breaking of images, a struggle that would last for more than a century. The empire found itself torn between two visions of holiness. The iconoclasts, or image breakers, believed that the divine could not be captured by mortal art, that to depict God was to limit him, and to worship such depictions was blasphemy. The iconodules, the image venerators, held that Christ's incarnation, his taking of human form, sanctified the visible world. To paint his face was to affirm his presence among men. Both sides prayed to the same God. Both saw themselves as defenders of truth. And yet, for generations, they exiled, imprisoned, and killed one another in his name. The empire was divided not by the sword but by the brush, wrote one monk, and the color of blood replaced the color of gold. Through this quiet civil war, Byzantium's streets grew tense and hushed. Artists worked in secret. Icons were hidden behind walls or buried in courtyards. Those who had once painted saints now carved crosses, simple, austere, stripped of form. And yet, beneath this surface of suppression, something profound was happening. The Byzantines were being forced to ask themselves what faith truly meant. Was beauty a danger or a doorway? Could the divine be known through matter or only through silence? In 787, after decades of turmoil, a council met in the city of Nicaea, the same city where, centuries earlier, Constantine had gathered bishops to define the creed of Christianity itself. Here, under the rule of Empress Irene, the council declared that icons could be venerated once more, not as gods, but as symbols of the divine made visible. The honor given to the image, they wrote, passes to its prototype. For a time, peace returned. Artists emerged from hiding, workshops reopened, the empire's churches slowly filled again with light and color. It was said that when the first restored icons were carried in procession through the streets of Constantinople, people wept openly. Gold shimmered once more upon the walls, and candles were lit as though welcoming back the sun. But the peace was fragile. A century later, the iconoclasts rose again, this time under Emperor Leo V. The images were destroyed once more. The walls turned cold and bare again. It seemed the empire was caught in an endless rhythm. Creation, destruction, renewal, as if mirroring the rise and fall of its own history. Finally, in 843, under the regency of Empress Theodora, named, perhaps not by chance, after the great empress of Justinian's time, the veneration of icons was restored permanently. That day was remembered as the triumph of orthodoxy and is still celebrated in the Eastern Church to this day. The mosaics returned, more luminous, more profound than before. Each tile placed in devotion, each face painted with a deeper awareness of suffering and grace. The Byzantines had learned, through struggle, that beauty itself was a form of prayer, that to see the divine in art was not idolatry, it was hope. And from that point forward, Byzantine art entered its golden age. In the shimmering mosaics of Hagia Sophia, angels stretched their wings across vaults of gold. Christ Pantocrator gazed from the domes with calm omnipotence, neither stern nor gentle, but infinite. Icons painted on wood glowed with eyes that seemed alive, silent teachers of patience and peace. The face of Christ, wrote one painter, is not of earth or heaven, but of both. To paint him is not to invent, but to remember. In that sentiment lay the heart of Byzantium, a civilization that had learned to express faith not through conquest, but through contemplation. Its walls might shrink, its armies might falter, but in art and in spirit, it grew ever richer. For the Byzantines had discovered something their ancestors never fully understood, that eternity does not roar, it whispers. And in those whispers, of brush against wood, of chant against stone, of candlelight against gold, the empire found its most lasting strength. We broke the images, one monk would later write, but they returned, for they were not painted on wood, but upon our hearts. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the empire that had once ruled the known world was smaller, yet more refined, more inward, more enduring than ever before. It had weathered wars, plagues, iconoclasts, and invasions. It had lost provinces and wealth, and still it lived. The Byzantines had learned something no empire before them ever had: how to survive the long twilight. They were not conquerors now, but custodians, guardians of a light that must never be allowed to go out. In their quiet persistence, they became a bridge between worlds. To the west, Europe was awakening from its centuries of slumber, new kings, new languages, new faiths, growing from the soil of what Rome had left behind. To the east, the great caliphates ruled with splendor and intellect, their scholars translating the wisdom of Greece into Arabic and sending it back westward like a reflected flame. And in between, Constantinople stood, the mediator, the survivor, the mirror of two civilizations. Its ships still crossed the seas, bearing silk from China, spices from India, and furs from the north. Its marketplaces still thrummed with voices in Greek, Arabic, Slavic, and Latin. Its gold coins, the solidas, stamped with the emperor's image, remained the world's most trusted currency, unbroken in purity for centuries. Wherever trade flowed, the mark of Byzantium followed. In this age, the empire became more than a state. It became an idea, a symbol of stability in a restless world. To foreigners, it was the queen of cities, dazzling, mysterious, untouchable. To its own people, it was the world itself, a city that contained within its walls the memory of all ages, from Caesar to Christ. The emperors of this era ruled with measured grace. They wore their crowns as symbols, not trophies, reminders that authority was stewardship, not possession. Court life was a choreography of ceremony, incense, golden lamps, processions that wound through the palace halls like rivers of light. Every act, every gesture was meant to reflect divine order, the empire itself as a living prayer. And yet, for all its ritual calm, the world beyond those walls was never still. New peoples pressed at the borders: Slavs, Bulgars, Rus, Arabs, Normans, each testing the empire's resolve. Some came with fire, others with curiosity. Each in turn would leave their mark. In the north, the empire found unlikely allies. The princes of Kievan Rus, drawn by trade and awe, sent envoys to Constantinople to see for themselves the city of legend. They entered the Hagia Sophia, where gold shimmered like sunlight on water, and heard the choirs rise in slow, eternal harmony. When they returned home, they told their prince, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth." In time, those same Slavic peoples would embrace the Orthodox faith, a gift from Byzantium that would shape the soul of Russia for 1,000 years. Through baptism and scripture, the empire's light spread northward, across rivers and forests, far beyond its political reach. Even as its borders shrank, its spirit expanded. To the Byzantines, this was victory of the purest kind, not of land, but of legacy. They no longer measured empire by conquest, but by influence, by the endurance of faith and beauty. At home, the city itself remained a marvel. The Theodosian walls, centuries old, still stood as they always had, triple lines of stone and moat, towers shining in the sun. For 1,000 years, no enemy breached them. Behind those walls, the people lived their lives: merchants, scholars, monks, children, all beneath domes that caught the light of morning and gave it back in gold. They believed their city was invincible, protected by the Virgin herself. And for centuries, that faith seemed justified. When enemies came, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, the city endured. When the earth trembled, it rebuilt. When the world changed, it adapted. Byzantium had become the master of survival, not through strength, but through grace. The historian Michael Sellos, writing in the 11th century, described it as a civilization made of thought more than of flesh. Its armies were smaller than in Rome's days, but its diplomacy was unmatched. Gold and wisdom served where swords could not. Emperors sent princesses in marriage, ambassadors with gifts, monks with relics, and spies with silver. And through it all, the empire endured, always bending, never breaking. "Steel breaks," Sellos wrote, "but silk endures." And Byzantium was silk. It moved with the subtlety of water, changing form, flowing around obstacles, reflecting the light of each new age. To those who looked from afar, it seemed eternal. To those who lived within it, it felt fragile, but precious. In the quiet monasteries that dotted the hills of Greece and Anatolia, monks copied the works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle by candlelight. They preserved the wisdom of a world long vanished, believing that every word saved was a prayer against forgetting. They saw themselves not as creators, but as guardians, keepers of a fire lit long ago when Rome first began to dream of eternity. Even as centuries turned, the Byzantines kept that fire alive. There were wars still, and betrayals. Rulers who rose in glory and fell in intrigue. But the pattern held: destruction, renewal, endurance. The empire was not a straight line, but a heartbeat, rising, falling, and rising again. And beneath it all, the city stood, Constantinople, the last Rome, the unbroken dream. At dusk, its skyline glowed in the fading sun, domes and towers silhouetted against the sea, gulls wheeling in slow arcs above the harbor. From the walls one could see the endless water, calm, eternal, mirroring the empire's own rhythm. As darkness fell, lanterns flickered along the streets and chants drifted from the churches, soft, low, endless. It was a city breathing through the centuries, its faith not shouted but sung. "We have outlived the world that made us," one monk wrote, "and yet we live still. For what is faith, if not the art of remaining?" Byzantium's art had become endurance itself. It had survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the coming of new nations and new creeds. It had lost almost everything that once defined the empire, and yet it remained luminous, self-contained, complete. It was the ember at the center of history, quiet, glowing, unconsumed. And as long as the lamps of Hagia Sophia burn, they said, the world itself will not end. By the 12th century, Constantinople was no longer the heart of the world, but it still beat with life. Its domes still gleamed in the morning sun, its bells still called the faithful to prayer, its markets still shimmered with silk and scent and song. Yet beneath that beauty, time was beginning to erode the foundations of its glory. The Byzantines had survived so much: invasion, plague, and fire, but the centuries of survival had left scars that gold and incense could not heal. Their borders had shrunk, their provinces had grown distant, their rulers, once emperors of the world, were now keepers of a smaller realm, still splendid, still proud but fragile. To the west, new powers had risen, the kingdoms of Europe, armored, ambitious, and restless. They called themselves Christian, yet their gaze upon Constantinople was not always kind. To the east, the Seljuk Turks had taken the old Roman lands of Anatolia, once the empire's breadbasket and heart. The walls still held, but beyond them the empire's lifeblood thinned. And yet, Constantinople remained magnificent. Even her enemies could not help but marvel. When travelers from the Latin West first saw the city, they wrote of its towers rising like music from the sea, of the vast walls that seemed to stretch to the horizon, of markets filled with jewels and glass and gold. To them, it was a vision of paradise made stone, richer and older than any kingdom they had ever known. But envy walks close behind admiration, and envy, in time, would become hunger. The turning point began, as so many do, in faith, or rather, in what faith can become when it is tangled with ambition. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, summoning the knights and kings of Europe to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. When those armies marched east, they passed through Byzantine lands, an empire they barely understood, yet depended upon for passage, food, and alliance. The Byzantines, ever pragmatic, helped them. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, wise and calculating, welcomed the Crusaders with diplomacy and gifts. He guided their campaigns, recovered lost cities, and, for a time, seemed to restore the empire's fortunes. But the Crusaders' gaze lingered on Constantinople itself, on its riches, its gold, its sanctuaries that glowed like dawn. The alliance between East and West was uneasy from the start. The Byzantines saw the Latins as crude and impetuous. The Latins saw the Byzantines as proud and treacherous. Both saw themselves as the true heirs of Christendom. For a time, the fragile cooperation held. But decades later, in the year 1204, the old mistrust finally became betrayal. It began with the Fourth Crusade, called not to the Holy Land, but diverted, through debt, politics, and manipulation, toward Constantinople itself. The Crusaders, owing money to the merchants of Venice, turned their crusade into conquest. What followed would be remembered not as a war, but as a wound. The ships came across the Sea of Marmara, sails white against the blue, crosses stitched upon them. But they carried not salvation, only greed. For days the Crusaders besieged the city. When the walls were breached, the Queen of Cities, unfallen for nearly 900 years, was taken by those who called themselves her brothers in faith. They poured through the streets, through the palaces, through the churches that had stood since Constantine. They looted the libraries, melted the icons, and tore gold from the altars. The Hagia Sophia, that great sanctuary of heaven on earth, was stripped and defiled, the altar shattered. The marble floors, once polished by centuries of prayer, were slick with blood and wine. They destroyed what they could not understand, wrote one Byzantine monk, hiding among the ruins. They called it victory, but it was despair. For 3 days, Constantinople was ravaged. The treasures of a millennium vanished. Relics, the crown of thorns, fragments of the true cross, the bones of saints, were carried away to the cathedrals of the West, where some remain to this day. When the fires died and the ships departed, what had been the greatest city in Christendom was left hollow, broken, weeping. The Byzantine Empire, that long, patient survivor, was shattered. The Latins set up their own rulers and called it the Latin Empire of Constantinople, but it was an empire of ash. And yet, even this was not the end. The Byzantines fled to the cities of Nicaea and Trebizond, clinging to fragments of their once boundless world. For 50 years they lived in exile, poor but unyielding, until at last, in 1261, they returned. The walls were rebuilt, the bells rang again, and once more the Byzantine flag, the double-headed eagle, flew above the domes of Constantinople. The city was smaller now, quieter, poorer, but alive. The people who had survived 1,000 years of siege had survived betrayal as well. They cleaned the blood from their churches, rebuilt their homes, and filled the air again with prayer. "We have been conquered," one chronicler wrote, "but not extinguished, for we have learned that even ruin can be holy." And so began the empire's final centuries, an age not of conquest, but of contemplation. A long twilight, where what remained of Rome lived in the flicker of lamps, the rhythm of chants, the careful preservation of what the world had forgotten. The world beyond moved on. France, England, and the rising Italian republics built their new futures. But in Byzantium, time seemed to flow differently. The people lived among ruins as among memories, walking through streets where every stone had a ghost, and in that quiet persistence, they found dignity. By the late 1200s, the empire's borders were little more than the city itself, a single jewel set in a widening sea of darkness, but that jewel still shone. Even as new powers rose, the Ottoman Turks, the Mamluks, the Venetians, Constantinople endured. Her churches glowed with candlelight. Her scholars copied the works of Homer, Plato, and Euclid. Her bells still rang out across the Bosporus, echoing faintly into a world that had already begun to forget her. "The night is long," one monk wrote, "but the flame is patient." The light of Byzantium had dimmed, but it was not gone. It still burned in the hearts of those who remembered, faint, flickering, eternal. By the middle of the 15th century, Constantinople had become a memory wrapped in stone. The empire of the Romans, the empire that had once ruled the world, was now no larger than the city itself, a fragile island surrounded by the tide of the Ottoman world. Beyond its walls, the banners of a new age already fluttered in the wind. The city was still beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than ever, because it knew it was dying. Its domes still gleamed, its bells still rang, its walls still stood like the ribs of some ancient giant guarding the last heartbeat of antiquity. Inside, life went on. Merchants opened their stalls, priests lit their candles, children played in courtyards that had once echoed with the steps of emperors. But outside the walls, a new power was gathering. Vast, young, and unstoppable. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, not yet 21 years old, ruled an empire that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Syria. He was brilliant, relentless, and utterly certain that destiny had chosen him to finish what history had begun. "There can be but one empire, and it shall be mine," he told his advisors, "and there can be but one city worthy of that empire, Constantinople." In the spring of 453, he surrounded the city with an army said to number over 100,000. Across the water, his ships filled the horizon. Along the land walls, those ancient stones built 1,000 years before by Theodosius, he placed his cannons, monstrous weapons of iron that shook the earth when they fired. Inside the city, there was no army left, only a few thousand soldiers, and the faith of a people who refused to abandon their home. At their head stood Constantine Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium. He was no conqueror, no distant monarch, but a weary, noble man who understood that his crown was a burden of memory. He ruled a city of ghosts, yet he bore himself like the emperors of old. He knew what was coming, and still he stayed. In the weeks before the siege began, Constantine walked the walls at dawn, speaking quietly with his captains, blessing the soldiers, thanking the common folk who brought them food and water. He prayed each morning in the Hagia Sophia, standing where Justinian and Heraclius and all the emperors before him had stood, under the same dome that had watched 1,000 years of history unfold. "If this is to be our end," he told his council, "let us make it worthy of our past." And so they prepared, calmly, without illusions. When the cannons opened fire, the sound rolled across the Bosporus like thunder. Day after day, the city trembled. Stones cracked, towers crumbled, dust and smoke filled the air. But each night, the citizens repaired what they could, lighting their lamps against the darkness. The siege lasted 53 days. Famine came, exhaustion followed, yet the city held. In the evenings, the people gathered in Hagia Sophia to pray. Greek, Latin, and Armenian voices rose together, the old divisions of Christendom forgotten in the face of fate. Candles flickered under the great dome, and the mosaics of saints seemed almost alive in the shifting light. "We are all one," said Constantine, "as long as this city stands." Outside, the Sultan's cannons roared without rest. And then, at dawn on May 29th, the walls finally broke. The Ottomans poured through the breaches, their banners snapping in the wind. The city that had outlasted 1,000 sieges was at last overwhelmed. Constantine rode into the heart of the fighting, his armor gleaming faintly in the rising light. Those who saw him said he fought like a man already halfway to legend, not for victory, but for dignity. When the last of his guards fell, he tore off the imperial insignia from his robes and disappeared into the chaos. His body was never found. "The emperor is dead," a survivor whispered, "but he fell as a Roman." The bells of Hagia Sophia rang one final time. The priests continued their liturgy even as the doors were broken open. It was said that as the invaders entered, a faint tremor shook the dome, and the last rays of morning lit the golden mosaics one final time before they were covered in plaster and silence. Outside, the city was quiet. The sun rose over the Bosporus, glinting on the water, on the towers, on the broken gates. The Queen of Cities had fallen. The Roman Empire, born on the hills of the Tiber more than 2,000 years before, had come to its end. And yet, even in that moment, something vast and serene remained. When Sultan Mehmed entered the city, he rode slowly through the ruined gates, his soldiers around him hushed. He looked upon the walls, the domes, the streets littered with smoke and rubble, and he is said to have murmured a single line from Persian verse: "The spider weaves the curtains in the halls of kings. The owl calls the watch in the towers of princes." He ordered that the city be spared, its people protected, its beauty restored. And when he entered Hagia Sophia, he stood for a long moment beneath its dome. Then, softly, he ordered that it become a mosque, not as desecration, but as continuation. For even conquerors can feel awe. Thus began the second life of Constantinople, reborn as Istanbul, capital of a new empire. And though the banners changed, the city remained what it had always been: the meeting of worlds, the light between seas, the place where heaven still seemed to touch the earth. "Empires pass," wrote a poet who witnessed the fall, "but the city endures, for she was built not only of stone, but of meaning." In the centuries that followed, the memory of that final dawn lingered, not in sorrow, but in reverence. The name of Constantine V passed into legend, whispered in prayers and songs. And the Hagia Sophia, through all its transformations, still stood, its dome still catching the first light of morning, as it had for 1,500 years. The empire was gone, but its dream of beauty, of wisdom, of endurance lived on. "Nothing truly ends," said a monk long after the fall. "It only changes its name." The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not the end of the world. It was the moment that the world changed shape. Empires don't really die. They dissolve, and the pieces of them keep moving, in language, in law, in memory. So it was with Byzantium, the last living branch of Rome. In the years after the city fell, small boats slipped west-west across the water, leaving the Bosporus in darkness. They carried monks, scribes, scholars, and books. So many books. They weren't just carrying belongings, they were carrying a civilization. Manuscripts that had been protected in Constantinople for 1,000 years, The dialogues of Plato, the plays of Sophocles, the geometry of Euclid, the histories of Herodotus, the medicine of Galen were carried to cities like Venice, Florence, and Rome. Those texts began to circulate in the Latin West, where much of that knowledge had been fragmentary or forgotten or replaced by memory and legend. And almost quietly, Europe began to wake. Artists in Florence started studying anatomy the way ancient physicians had described it. Architects looked again at domes, arches, vaults, the mathematics of harmony, the way Byzantium had balanced mass and light. Printers, newly working with movable type, began to copy Greek works that had rarely been seen outside monastic libraries. A word emerged for this rediscovery: rinascita, rebirth. We call it the Renaissance. One Italian humanist wrote, almost in awe, "There are men who come from the East who have preserved for us the wisdom of Athens through the empire of Constantine. We thought these books were gone from the world." That is the first piece of Byzantium's legacy: memory. It didn't just protect Rome's past, it delivered that past forward at the exact moment the world was able to use it again. But the empire didn't only move west, it also moved north. For centuries before the fall, Byzantium had already been shaping the spiritual world of the Slavs. In Kiev, in Novgorod, in Moscow. From Constantinople came priests and architects, liturgies and icons, alphabets and saints' lives. The Russ's princes sent envoys to the Hagia Sophia and came back changed. They said the worship there felt not of this earth. They wanted that feeling at home. So Byzantine Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, took root in the lands of the Russes. The shape of the liturgy, the slow candlelit chant, the golden halos over calm, watchful faces, the belief that beauty itself was a form of prayer, all of that lived on long after the empire that created it was gone. Cathedrals rose in that style, scripture was copied in that style, kings were crowned with that style of holiness around them. And even when Constantinople finally fell, the idea of a Christian empire guided by sacred order did not fall with it. Instead, that idea whispered north that someone must now carry it. You start to see people in Moscow calling their city not just a capital, but the third Rome. Rome fell, Constantinople fell, we stand now in their place. We are the last guard of order. That's the second piece of Byzantium's legacy: succession. The crown didn't disappear, it migrated, and there was a third current, one that flowed not west and not north, but stayed exactly where it was, because Constantinople did not fall into silence. When Mehmed II entered the city, he didn't flatten it. He claimed it. He made it his capital. He restored its walls. He repaired its waterworks. He protected its markets. He looked up at Hagia Sophia, already nearly 1,000 years old, and said, essentially, we will keep this. We will pray here now. That moment matters. The Ottomans did not simply replace Byzantium. They absorbed it. They stepped into its physical spaces, its administrative structures, even some of its court rituals. They took the greatest city of the Christian East and made it the greatest city of the Muslim East, and in doing so, they kept it alive. The result was a kind of continuity that almost shouldn't be possible. The skyline stayed familiar: domes, minarets, towers. The city stayed what it had always been, the bridge between worlds. You still hear many languages in the markets. You still saw caravans arriving from Asia, ships from the Black Sea, grain from the Nile. If you stood on the seawalls at dawn and watched light spill across the Golden Horn, you were looking at the same curve of water emperors had watched 1,000 years earlier. Even the idea of the ruler, not just as a warlord, but as a divinely backed guardian of civilization, survived the handover. The Ottomans, like the Byzantines, presented themselves not just as kings, but as stewards of order. So that's the third piece of Byzantium's legacy: continuation. The line of empire did not snap, it bent. And underneath all of that, beneath the flow of books, the transfer of titles, the changing of banners, something even quieter survived. Byzantium had believed that beauty was not decoration. Beauty was proof. Beauty was evidence that the world, even in pain, still connected to something higher. That belief outlived the empire. You can still feel it, even now, in places shaped by its descendants. In Orthodox icons, flat gold backgrounds, enormous gentle eyes, faces that seem to exist both here and somewhere beyond here. In domes that seem to hang suspended without weight, like Hagia Sophia's great vault, a deliberate attempt to make stone behave like light. in law codes and charters that insist rulers are bound to justice, not above it, a line that runs, in a very real sense, from Justinian's law courts forward into European legal tradition. Even in Western painting, when you see a halo around a saint in the 1400s, that's not Roman, that's Byzantine, that's gold ground, that's the empire still speaking. So the legacy is not only survival and not only influence, it's Byzantium taught the world how to endure slowly. Rome had once conquered by marching. Byzantium endured by waiting. Rome ruled with legions and tribute. Byzantium ruled with memory, ritual, diplomacy, and time. And when the empire was finally gone, the world it left behind, Renaissance Italy, Orthodox Russia, Ottoman Istanbul, each took one of those strands and pulled it forward. The empire has changed its garments, a monk wrote after the fall, but not its soul. Byzantium's soul lived on in the west as recovered knowledge. It lived on in the north as a sacred empire. It lived on in the east as the living city itself. The map moved, the idea did not. And that is where we are now in our story. Not at an ending and not in mourning, but standing in that dim glowing space after the empire's fall, watching where the light goes next. Because the story isn't over. It just stops calling itself Byzantium. Florence, Venice, Genoa, these weren't empires in the old Roman sense. They were city-states, merchant republics, fragile, proud, brilliant, jealous. Their strength didn't come from legions. It came from money, trade networks, and something new that the medieval world hadn't fully embraced: curiosity. These cities were already wealthy. They bought silk from the east, copper and timber from the north, spices from Alexandria. They financed kings. They insured cargo. They negotiated with priests. But something was still missing. They had wealth. They had power. What they wanted next was legitimacy, a connection to something older, grander, unquestionable. They wanted Rome. Not the Rome of knights and popes, the Rome of Cicero, Augustus, Virgil, Seneca, the Rome of clean Latin, balanced law, measured reason, and beautiful proportion, a Rome of marble minds. And then, almost on cue, the refugees from Constantinople arrived. They came like messengers from another century. Some spoke Greek as their first language, not Latin. Some had studied in libraries that went back unbroken to late antiquity. Some had copied works no one in Italy had seen in the original form for 1,000 years. They arrived in the middle of a culture that was hungry for exactly what they carried. Imagine the scene. A scribe from Constantinople sits in a candlelit room in Florence, slowly, patiently reading Plato aloud in Greek to a room of astonished Italian scholars. They stop him every few lines to ask questions. They argue, they pace, they go silent. They are hearing a voice from 1,800 years ago, and it is not coming through a filter of war and theology and translation and rumor. It is alive in the room. This is dynamite. It begins to change, because now artists are told to study the body as an object of proportion and harmony, not just as a symbolic vessel for a soul. It changes architecture, because now patrons want buildings that look classical, which in practice often means drawing not only from Rome, but from Byzantine engineering and spatial logic. The dome of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, for example, owes as much to the problem-solving of Hagia Sophia as it does to any ruin in Italy. It changes philosophy because suddenly old questions are being asked again. What is virtue? What is justice? Is beauty moral? Can a state be both strong and good? And quietly, it changes politics. Because Italian rulers begin to realize something very old and very powerful. If you wrap yourself in Rome, you don't just look rich, you look rightful. So dukes, bankers, and merchant princes start hiring scholars to write lineages for them, to claim that their families somehow descend from ancient Roman houses, to claim continuity. They commission statues in Roman style, triumphal arches, equestrian bronze figures. They carve Latin inscriptions onto buildings the way emperors once stamped their names on public baths and aqueducts. It is cosplay, yes, but it's also worship. They are trying to pull the authority of the empire back into the present by imitating its language, proportions, gestures, and crown. This is the first way the Byzantine torch burns in the West, through prestige, through the revival of Rome as an aesthetic and moral standard. But there's a second way, and it's bigger. Those manuscripts from Constantinople didn't only carry poetry and philosophy. They carried science, Greek astronomy, Greek medicine, Greek mathematics, Greek geography. Europe had pieces of this already, through Arabic transmission, through monastic copying, but not like this. Not in this volume, not in this concentration, not with this confidence. So you see a shift. People in Italy start to test the world again, dissecting bodies, mapping coasts, measuring shadows, tracking the sky. They begin to believe, very quietly at first, that the world can be known, that it is not just a test or a valley of tears, but a structure, something with order. That is a Roman thought, carried through Byzantium, sparked again in Italy. We are not only surviving, wrote one Florentine thinker, we are beginning. And that is where we leave this piece of the story for now, with Italy not just admiring the past, but using it, extracting energy from it, drawing authority and curiosity out of a world that until recently had seemed lost. Because while the empire on the Bosporus has fallen, its books are now on desks in Florence. Its geometry is being applied to domes. Its theology is being argued in Latin. Its concept of imperial dignity is being worn, quite literally, in borrowed robes at Italian courts. The empire is gone. But in the West, it has started to bloom again in another shape. While the ships of Byzantium scholars sailed west toward Italy, another current of its legacy flowed north, into the forests and rivers of the Slavs. There, in frozen lands far from the Bosporus, the empire's spirit found refuge not in marble or law, but in prayer. For centuries before Constantinople fell, the Byzantine faith had already taken root among the Rus, the early Slavic peoples of Kiev and Novgorod. Long before the Renaissance awakened in the West, the North had been quietly transformed by Byzantine missionaries, artists, and priests. They carried not swords, but words and images. The story begins in the 10th century, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev sent envoys to learn about the great religions of the world. He wished to know which faith his people should follow. The envoys visited the mosques of the Bulgars, the synagogues of the Jews, the cathedrals of the Latin West, and finally they came to Constantinople. There they entered the Hagia Sophia, the same vast dome under which emperors had prayed for nearly 500 years. And what they saw changed everything. We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth, they later wrote. There is no such beauty anywhere else. We only know that God dwells there among men. When the envoys returned, Vladimir made his choice. He adopted the Orthodox faith, not for conquest or politics, but for beauty, for the vision of heaven reflected on earth. And with that baptism, the spirit of Byzantium flowed into the rivers of the north. From Constantinople came priests and artists, engineers and architects. They built churches in wood and stone, taught the liturgy in Slavic tongues, and shaped the first alphabets of the Russes. Icons, small windows of gold and silence spread across the land, glowing in candlelight amid the snow. Through them, the people of the north learned to see as the Byzantines had seen, that light itself could be sacred. In time, this faith became not just religion, but identity. The Russian chronicles spoke of Constantinople as Tsargrad, the city of Caesar. They saw it as their elder sister, their spiritual mother. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the shock rippled through the monasteries and courts of the Rus like distant thunder. The second Rome has fallen, one monk wrote. The third stands, and there will be no fourth. That third Rome was Moscow. It was a bold claim, almost unimaginable at the time. Moscow was still a modest principality, wrapped in forest and snow, its power only beginning to rise. But in faith, it felt ancient. Its princes and priests believed that the mantle of empire, the sacred duty to guard Christendom, had passed to them when Constantinople fell. They were now the stewards of that flame. From that idea came a vision of kingship shaped by Byzantium's own example. The ruler was not merely a prince, but a czar, a word born of Caesar. His authority was divine, yet bound by the order of heaven. The empire was not a territory, but a responsibility. Its purpose was not expansion, but preservation. That vision would guide Russia for centuries, sometimes as faith, sometimes as ambition, sometimes as both. It would outlast dynasties, revolutions, and wars. And at its heart was always the same conviction, that the empire of the spirit could never truly fall. In the centuries that followed, the artists of the North continued to paint in the Byzantine style. Even as the West turned toward realism and perspective, the icon painters of Moscow kept their faces flat, their gold unbroken, their halos wide. For them, art was not about likeness, it was about truth. An icon was not a portrait, it was a presence. If you stood in a Russian monastery in winter, the air sharp with incense and cold, you could still feel the rhythm of Constantinople in the chants and colors. The empire might be gone, but its heartbeat remained. The monks of the Trinity Lavra near Moscow became the new keepers of that rhythm. There, Andrei Rublev painted his quiet masterpieces, icons so delicate, so still, that they seemed to breathe. His Trinity became one of the most beloved images of Orthodox faith. 3 figures at a table, their faces calm and luminous, their gestures forming a perfect circle of unity. It is perhaps the purest expression of Byzantium's vision ever made. Beauty as theology, stillness as strength. "The saints are not looking at us," a later monk wrote. "They are looking through us." And through them, Byzantium continued to look through time. As the centuries turned, Moscow grew, first a duchy, then a kingdom, then an empire. Its rulers crowned themselves with Byzantine titles, married into old imperial bloodlines, and built cathedrals crowned with gilded domes that rose like flame against the snow. Inside those cathedrals, the old Greek hymns still echoed, translated now into Slavic voices. When envoys from Western Europe visited, they were astonished. To them, this far northern court seemed to belong to another age, as though the lost empire of the East had been quietly reborn in the forests of Russia. "They call themselves the heirs of Constantine," one traveler wrote, and perhaps they are. It wasn't only a claim of faith, it was a memory of form. The Byzantine love of order, hierarchy, and divine symmetry found a new home here. The coronation of the czars echoed the anointing of emperors. Their palaces mirrored the plan of Constantinople's great palace. Even the double-headed eagle, once the symbol of the Byzantine emperors, was adopted as Russia's own. The Byzantines had believed that heaven and empire could reflect one another, and in Moscow, that mirror was polished again. Yet, beneath all the grandeur, the heart of the inheritance remained simple. Faith as endurance. Just as Byzantium had survived siege and plague through patience, the Orthodox world learned to survive its winters, its wars, its exiles, by turning endurance into art. Every candle lit before an icon was, in its own way, a continuation of 1,000 years of prayer. "The city fell," one monk said softly, "but the light did not go out. It only moved north." And in that light, flickering in gold leaf, shining over rivers frozen in silence, the world of Byzantium lived on, quiet and eternal. In the spring of 1453, Constantinople became Istanbul, but those who stood on its walls would have recognized its soul long after the banners changed. The conqueror Mehmed II was barely 21, young, brilliant, ambitious, and deeply aware of history. When his army broke through the Theodosian walls, he did not come as a destroyer. He came as someone stepping into a legend. For centuries, the Ottoman sultans had called themselves Ghazis, warriors for the faith. But Mehmed had a larger vision. He saw himself not only as the heir to Islam's caliphs, but as the successor to Rome's emperors. He studied Greek philosophy, read histories of Alexander and Caesar, and dreamed of ruling from the same seat as Constantine. When he entered the city, he is said to have murmured a single line of Persian verse. "The spider weaves the curtains in the halls of kings, and the owl calls the watch in the towers of princes." Even conquerors know the silence of ruins. But Mehmed's silence did not last long. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and stood beneath its vast dome. Dust and smoke drifted through shafts of light from the high windows. He looked upward, whispered a prayer in Arabic, and ordered that the church be preserved. It would become a mosque, Hagia Sophia Kami, but it would remain the same house of God. The mosaics of Christ and the saints were covered, not destroyed. The altar was left in place beneath the carpets. The echo of the choir gave way to the echo of the call to prayer. And so 2 faiths began to share one space, not in harmony perhaps, but in endurance. Outside the church, the Sultan ordered something astonishing. The city would be rebuilt. He did not want a trophy. He wanted a capital, a city worthy of empire. He repaired the aqueducts that still carried water from Thrace. He reopened the ancient markets of the Forum. He restored the walls and gates that had withstood 1,000 years of sieges. He invited back the merchants, the craftsmen, the scholars, and even the surviving Greeks who had fled during the conquest. "Let this be a city for all peoples," he said, "for every tongue that God has made." And so Istanbul was born, a city of many voices, many gods' names, many histories, all folded into one. Over the next decades, it became the beating heart of the Ottoman world. Minarets rose beside domes, their slender spires pointing upward like drawn quills against the sky. The skyline changed, yet remained familiar, a forest of stone that still gleamed gold at sunrise. New architects arrived, inspired by the same geometry that had guided the builders of Justinian's age. They studied Hagia Sophia's floating dome and turned it into a new vocabulary of grace. From those studies came the imperial mosques, the Fatih, the Süleymaniye, the Blue Mosque, each one a descendant of Byzantine genius dressed in Ottoman form. Stone learned to pray in another language, wrote one chronicler, but it prayed the same prayer. Inside these mosques, light fell as it had always fallen, from high windows and hanging lamps gilding the air. The same silence lingered beneath the arches, the same sense that heaven might be near. The city's rhythm was familiar too. The markets reopened, filled with silk and spice. Ships came from Egypt, from Crimea, from the Aegean Islands. Sailors still watched the same seabirds wheel over the Bosporus. The same tide still lapped against the same stones. Even its name, Istanbul, carried continuity. It came from the Greek phrase eis ten Polin, to the city. For centuries, that was how traders and travelers referred to Constantinople. They didn't say its name. They said simply the city, because none other compared. So the name Istanbul was not new. It was the old name, softened by centuries of use, spoken by new tongues. And in that small detail, that gentle shift of language, lies the truth of its transformation. The empire changed faith, ruler, and flag, but not its rhythm. The city remained the city. By the 16th century, Istanbul had become the largest city in Europe, home to nearly 1 million souls. Its streets rang with many languages: Greek, Turkish, Arabic, Armenian, Hebrew, Italian, Persian. It was the meeting of continents, the crossroads of every road Rome had ever built. To walk its streets was to walk through layers of time. Roman aqueducts carried Ottoman water. Byzantine cisterns cooled the homes of new merchants. Mosaics slept beneath plaster. Icons slumbered under paint. The empire had become a palimpsest, a manuscript rewritten but never erased. And under the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, Istanbul reached its second golden age. He commissioned the architect Sinan to design mosques, bridges, and aqueducts that would rival, and in their own way honor, those of Justinian. Sinan studied the Hagia Sophia for years, measuring its dome, tracing its acoustics, decoding its balance of mass and light. Then with reverence, he expanded upon it. The result was harmony. The Süleymaniye Mosque stands across the Golden Horn like a mirror of Hagia Sophia, younger, different, yet clearly its child. One built for Christ, the other for Allah, both rising toward the same sky. "We do not erase what is beautiful," Sinan wrote, "we will continue it." That, perhaps, is Istanbul's truest identity. Not a conquest, but a continuation. A place where civilizations overlap like waves upon the same shore. And even now, if you stand on the Galata Bridge at dusk and look across the water toward those twin domes glowing in the last light, you can still feel it, the whisper of ages, the hum of unbroken presence. The Byzantines are gone, the Ottomans are gone, but the city remains. Its stones have learned every tongue, every prayer, every silence. The world changes around it, and still it breathes. "All empires end," wrote an Ottoman poet, "but the city endures and endures and endures." By the 17th century, the city of Istanbul, once Constantinople, was vast and glittering, a world entire. The domes of Sinan's mosques rose above the sea like constellations made of stone. From dawn until dusk, the muezzin's call shimmered across the water, echoing the bells that had rung there centuries before. But even as the voice of the empire filled the air, the strength beneath it had begun to fade. The Ottomans had ruled from this city for more than 200 years. Their lands stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algiers to the Caspian. Yet the pattern that had visited every empire, the long slope from glory to gravity, had begun its slow return. The warning signs were quiet at first. A war that cost more gold than it returned. A harvest that came too late. A generation of sultans raised behind walls of silk, no longer hardened by the marches their ancestors had known. The bureaucracy thickened, the armies slowed, and beyond the borders, the world was changing in ways the old order could not see. In the west, ships now crossed oceans instead of seas. Gold from the New World flooded the markets of Europe, while the Silk Road, once the artery of empire, emptied like a river whose source had moved. In the north, science began to challenge faith, and kings began to speak of nations rather than realms of God. A new vocabulary of power was being written, one that the empires of marble and mosque could scarcely translate. For Istanbul, it was the beginning of a long twilight, not of sudden collapse, but of quiet erosion. Still, the city endured. Fires would sweep through its wooden quarters, earthquakes would shake its hills, new palaces would rise on the ruins of the old. Each time, the people rebuilt, patient as ever. The Byzantines had taught endurance, the Ottomans practiced it. Along the Golden Horn, the shipyards still rang with hammers. In the bazaars, traders from 3 continents still bartered under painted ceilings. And above it all, the sultans still walked the marble courts of Topkapi Palace, where fountains murmured among cypress trees and the scent of rosewater drifted on the breeze. But the silence of the halls grew longer. Decisions once made by emperors were now whispered by viziers. Power began to move sideways, from sword to pen, from throne to office, from the certainty of command to the slow negotiations of survival. The empire, wrote one Ottoman chronicler, has become like a garden after harvest, still beautiful, but waiting for rain. Beyond the palace gates, the people lived much as they always had. Fishermen cast their nets in the Bosporus, scribes copied poetry in candlelight. Children flew kites from the hills of Üsküdar, watching them drift over the same waters that had reflected Rome's sails 1,000 years before. Life continued, smaller perhaps, but no less real. And through those ordinary days, the city learned a quiet wisdom, that not every decline is a tragedy. Some are simply transformations. As the centuries turned, the empire adapted. Diplomats replaced conquerors, trade routes replaced crusades, old enemies became cautious partners. The Ottomans sent embassies to Paris and London, curious about this new European order, a world of machines, markets, and reason. The envoys returned with sketches of clocks, cannons, telescopes, and gardens laid out in precise geometry. They spoke of a Europe that was built with mathematics instead of mysticism. The empire began to imitate, just as Byzantium once had imitated Rome. New schools appeared, new sciences were studied. Printing presses, once viewed with suspicion, began to turn slowly in the corners of Istanbul's markets. Paper joined parchment. The modern age began to whisper at the door. Yet for every step forward, there was a shadow. The empire's outer provinces, Greece, Serbia, Egypt, began to stir with their own sense of identity. They spoke of nationhood, of freedom, of rebirth. And in their rebellions, one could hear the echo of the very idea that had once sustained the empire itself, that divine order must be renewed when it grows old. It was the same cycle, returning again. By the 18th century, Europe called the Ottoman world the sick man. But within the empire, poets still wrote of beauty and faith still carried the day. They did not see sickness. They saw age, and age to them was not shame. It was the proof that endurance had meaning. One poet compared the empire to the moon. Each night it wanes, and each dawn it rises again, for the sky has made it its mirror. And indeed, Istanbul at night still shone like a reflection of heaven. Lanterns along the bridges, lamps in the mosques, stars mirrored in the water, 1,000 small lights carrying the memory of the one great light that had burned there since Constantine. It was not the empire of Justinian anymore, nor the empire of Suleiman, nor even the empire of faith that Mehmed had imagined. It was something quieter now, a civilization learning how to live in its own shadow. "The glory is behind us," said a court historian, "but its light still lies on our faces." And that was true, because decline, in the rhythm of history, is only another form of memory. And memory, if kept with dignity, becomes its own kind of empire. As the sun set over the Bosporus, the city's domes turned bronze, then rose, then disappeared into blue. The call to prayer drifted across the water, and in that sound, ancient, gentle, unbroken, one could still hear the pulse of every Rome that had ever been. When empires end, they do not vanish. They leave behind echoes, in words, in customs, in the architecture of thought. What was once law becomes a proverb. What was once power becomes poetry. And in that transformation, the past finds its gentlest immortality. By the 19th century, the old Ottoman world, the last visible thread of Rome, was waning. Its armies had grown weak, its provinces restless, its sultans wearied by the weight of inheritance. Yet even as its body faded, its spirit deepened. The empire that had once ruled through conquest now ruled through memory, through the stories its people told about what it had been and what it had meant. Everywhere, that memory took on different forms. In the marble courtyards of Istanbul, poets still wrote verses in the old Ottoman tongue, a fusion of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, rich with metaphor and music. They compared the city to a garden after rain, to a rose caught forever between bloom and fall. They wrote of faith, of love, of fate, but beneath every word was a longing for permanence, for something that could survive time. The empire, wrote one, has become the sky above us. We no longer live in it, we live beneath it. And in that line lies the truth of memory itself. It does not rule, it surrounds. Across the empire's former lands, from Greece to Syria, from Bosnia to Egypt, that same memory lingered like perfume. A turn of phrase here, a melody there, a pattern in a carpet, a word borrowed and never returned. Even where rebellion had torn the political bond apart, the cultural bond remained. Byzantine forms lived in Ottoman mosques. Ottoman verses survived in Balkan songs. The rhythm of prayer, the ornament of language, the quiet respect for endurance, all were threads of the same fabric. And within Istanbul itself, life continued with that peculiar grace only old cities possess. Tram bells clanged along cobbled streets where emperors had once marched. Children played football in the shadows of domes built by two faiths. Old men drank tea beneath plane trees whose roots had outlived kingdoms. The skyline, a dream of arches and spires, still shimmered at dusk, as though the centuries themselves were a single long evening. Every age builds its own Istanbul, wrote a modern historian, but the stones remember all of them, and they do. For the city, more than any text, became the keeper of memory. In its layers, one can trace the lineage of civilization itself. The Roman aqueducts still carry water, the Byzantine cisterns still hold it, the Ottoman fountains still give it. To drink in this city is to taste 3,000 years at once. Even its sounds are historical. Church bells no longer ring, yet the pattern of the call to prayer, 5 times each day, follows the same rhythm that once marked the canonical hours of the monks. Morning, noon, evening, night, always that same reminder. The day has form, the world has order, time still moves with intention. The city never forgot how to mark time. It simply changed the words. Elsewhere, the empire's memory turned inward. When nations broke away, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, they built their own stories from what had come before. They reinterpreted history not as separation, but as inheritance. The Byzantine mosaics of Athens became the inspiration for new churches. The Ottoman minarets of Sarajevo became symbols of beauty, not occupation. The world had fractured, but its fragments still shone with the same light. It is a strange kind of continuity, the kind that outlives agreement. By the late 19th century, Europe's artists had begun to notice this light again. Painters and poets from France, Britain, and Germany traveled east in search of something the modern world had lost: mystery, calm, depth. They called it Orientalism, but what they were really seeking was memory, the whisper of the ancient world that still hung in the air east of the Adriatic. They found it in the blue tiles of Istanbul, in the silence of old churches converted into mosques, in the way light softened everything it touched. They painted the domes, the markets, the shadows, not as reality, but as dream. And so Byzantium, the Ottomans, and Rome were reborn once more, this time in art. The East, wrote one English traveler, is where time stands still enough to be heard. But in the city itself, time did not stand still. It simply slowed. It became contemplative. In the quiet homes along the Bosporus, women embroidered verses of the Quran beside the same windows where their grandmothers had once embroidered Christian prayers. In the markets, Greek and Turkish merchants haggled in a mixture of both languages, their words stitched together like mosaic tiles. In the libraries, calligraphers copied Arabic and Greek texts side by side, the same hand, the same devotion, the same patience. Istanbul had learned the oldest wisdom of all, that survival sometimes means accepting change without surrender. When the Ottoman Empire finally came to its end in 1922, replaced by the Republic of Turkey, the change was immense. New borders, new alphabets, new laws. But beneath the surface of modernity, the old pulse remained. The city still faced two continents, its waters are still divided and connected worlds, its domes still curved toward heaven, golden in the same light Constantine had once known. "We have become modern," wrote a poet of that generation, "but our shadows are ancient." And indeed, those shadows were long. They stretched through music, in the slow, ornamented melodies of Turkish makam, direct descendants of Byzantine chant. They lingered in architecture, in the symmetry of courtyards and domes, the reverence for light and geometry. They endured in philosophy, in the belief that the divine can be glimpsed through order, beauty, and patience. The Byzantines had called it cosmos, the harmony of heaven mirrored on earth. And even now that idea lay quietly beneath the modern world, like a foundation under the pavement. The city carried on speaking many languages, sometimes all at once. A muezzin's voice mixed with the laughter of children and the hum of trams. Ships from Odessa and Alexandria still moored at the same quays once used by Roman galleys. At sunset, the skyline still glowed like a prayer, the minarets catching light as the seagulls circled high above the sea. The historian Stephen Runciman once wrote that Byzantium's greatest gift was the art of being civilized. That art, subtle, persistent, almost invisible, never left. It lived on in manners, in rituals, in the unspoken understanding that refinement is not weakness and patience is not passivity. It lived in the way tea is poured, slowly and carefully, in the way one greets a guest, in the way conversation lingers long after the meal has ended. "The empire is gone," said one elderly scholar in the 1950s, "but we still behave as though the angels might be listening." And perhaps they are, because what began as an empire has become ethos, a quiet dignity that threads through centuries of change. Today, if you walk through Istanbul at dawn, you will still find it. Before the city fully wakes, the air is soft, the water silver. The domes catch the first light, the call to prayer rises, the ferries begin to move. And in that moment, all the layers of time, Rome, Byzantium, Ottoman, seem to exist together. The world hums, alive with memory. "Cities remember so that we do not have to," a writer once said. "They dream in our place." And in that dream of arches and light, of chants and sails and seagulls, Byzantium still lives. Not as power, but as presence. Not as an empire, but as an echo. A melody without beginning or end, carried forward by those who still pause to listen. By the 20th century, the empires of the Old World were gone. The Ottoman sultans had departed their palaces. The kings of Europe had traded crowns for exile. The marble eagles of Rome, the double-headed eagles of Byzantium, the crescent standards of Istanbul, all folded, stored, remembered. Yet somehow their reflections remained. The world had entered the modern age, but it still carried the shape of the ancient one. To understand that shape, one has only to look into the mirror of history. Every empire that has ever lived, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, British, Soviet, American, carries in its bones the same pattern, a beginning of faith and fervor, an age of expansion and creation, a long maturity of wealth, art, and confidence. And then the quiet, almost imperceptible slide into reflection, when people begin to tell stories about what they once were. Byzantium had lived that pattern longer than any. 1,000 years between Constantine's crown and Mehmed's cannon. 1,000 years of believing that the world could be ordered by beauty. And in its endurance, it left the world a lesson that even now we are still trying to learn, that the true measure of civilization is not how loudly it rises, but how gracefully it declines. "The empire did not fall," wrote one historian, "it turned inward." And so too do we. Every generation turns inward eventually, nations, families, individuals alike. We inherit the ruins of those who came before and ask the same question that haunted the last Byzantine emperors. What endures? Is it power, faith, art, or simply memory, the act of remembering itself? In the quiet halls of old museums, the fragments of empire answer softly. A piece of mosaic here, gold leaf catching the light, a shard of glass still glimmering blue, a book copied by hand 1,000 years ago, its pages thin as breath. All these are remnants of an idea, that beauty is worth the labor of preservation, that to make something well, even in fading times, is an act of hope. "To write," said a Byzantine monk, "is to build a city in words." Perhaps that is what we are all doing, building invisible cities out of memory and meaning, hoping that someone, somewhere, will walk their streets after we are gone. In that sense, Byzantium has never really left us. Its vision, that civilization is a sacred duty, that the material and the divine can be joined through art, still hums beneath our modern world. We build skyscrapers, not cathedrals, data networks, not aqueducts, but the instinct is the same. We reach for permanence, we carve order out of chaos, we long to be remembered kindly by time. The Byzantines understood that longing. It was carved into their icons, painted into their walls, written in the slow, curved letters of their script. They built not for glory alone, but for continuity, for the moment when someone centuries later would stand in the same light and understand. When you walk into the Hagia Sophia today, whether you come as pilgrim or tourist, believer or skeptic, you become part of that understanding. You hear the footsteps of centuries. You see the same shimmer of gold, the same drift of dust in light. The empire is gone, but its idea still works on you. You become, if only for a heartbeat, a citizen of that eternal city. And that is the miracle of memory. It makes us contemporaries of the past. The same happens elsewhere, too. In Rome, where the Colosseum still stands, weathered and silent. In London, where domes and government buildings borrow their symmetry from classical plans. In Washington, where marble columns still echo the language of temples. In St. Petersburg, where the domes of Orthodox cathedrals gleam over frozen rivers. Everywhere, the reflection of the empire glints, different, distant, yet recognizable. The world no longer needs emperors, but it still borrows their light. We build not to dominate, wrote an Ottoman architect, but to remember that the divine once dwelled among men. That is the quiet promise all these ruins and replicas keep, that what is sacred is not conquest, but continuity, that the act of building, of preserving, of remembering, is itself a form of devotion. It is why the mosaics of Ravenna still shine, why scholars still translate Justinian's law, why Hagia Sophia still draws pilgrims even when its meaning changes with the age. Each is a mirror, a surface through which we glimpse what the world once believed itself to be. And if you look long enough, you begin to see something else, yourself. For every civilization, in the end, is a mirror held up to its people. It reflects not only their power, but their patience, not only their monuments, but their mistakes. And in that reflection, the empire of memory begins again. We think history is behind us, wrote the poet Seferis, but it walks beside us, whispering. In the glow of night over Istanbul, you can almost hear it. The sea murmurs against the stones. A ferry crosses from Europe to Asia, its lights floating like candles on the water. Somewhere a muezzin calls, the same melody that has drifted over this city for 15 centuries. And in that sound, faint and eternal, the mirrors align. Rome, Byzantium, Istanbul, one reflection, seen through time. The empire is gone, but the mirror remains. It lives in art and in architecture, in the balance of proportion, in the grace of restraint, in the patience of those who preserve, in every quiet act of remembering that says softly, "We were here." And when future centuries look back on us, they too will find our reflection, the remnants of our own empire of light and noise and invention. They will ask what we valued, what we built, what we left behind. And perhaps they will see that we too tried to turn chaos into order, that we too dreamed of beauty that could last. Empires pass, wrote one Byzantine chronicler, but the longing for them is immortal. And so the mirrors remain, not to glorify, but to remind, that every age is a reflection, that every civilization, however bright, casts both light and shadow, and that wisdom lies not in denying the shadow, but in seeing the light still moving through it. As the night deepens over the Bosporus, the last ferries return to harbor. The city's lights shimmer on the water, gold, silver, faint blue, and for a moment, all the ages seem to look at one another across the glass of time. Rome sees Byzantium, Byzantium sees Istanbul, and the present sees them both, quietly reflected in itself. The mirror does not keep the light, says an old saying from the monasteries of Mount Athos. It only shows that it was there. And so we look and remember, and through remembering, keep the light alive. History often feels like distance, like something gone. But sometimes if you listen carefully, you realize it's still here, underfoot, overhead, within us. Every road we drive, every law we follow, every word we speak that carries an ancient root, all of it is the quiet continuation of things that were never truly lost. And nowhere is that truer than in the story of Rome and Byzantium. The old empire is gone, yes. The emperors are dust, the armies long vanished, the marble worn down to memory. But the idea that shaped them, the longing for order, beauty, meaning, never left. It seeped into everything that followed. It's in the symmetry of our cities, in the curved domes of our churches and museums, in the rituals of law, in the vocabulary of governance, in the languages we still use to speak of power and faith. Senate, Caesar, Basilica, Empire, Republic, civilization, each one an echo, still ringing after 2,000 years. And even where the words have changed, the rhythm remains. When we talk about decline and rebirth, progress and fall, we are speaking the language Rome invented. When we dream of order out of chaos, of a civilization that can outlast its makers, we are dreaming the same dream Byzantium kept alive when the world around it was breaking. The empire is not a place, one monk wrote in the 14th century. It is a way of seeing. That way of seeing, that conviction that beauty, knowledge, and faith belong together, still moves quietly through the modern world. We see it in the great libraries and universities that trace their lineage back to the scriptoria of Constantinople, in the courts of law, whose arguments still quote the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, in the hospitals whose ethics rest on the foundations laid by Byzantine medicine, even in the mosaics of digital light that now cover our walls, bright, tessellated screens, carrying the same instinct to preserve, to illuminate, to connect. Rome built roads, we built networks. Byzantium copied texts, we copy data. The tools have changed, but the desire is the same, to link the scattered parts of the human story into something that endures. And perhaps that is why these echoes still feel alive, because we have become the new custodians of what the ancients began. Every generation inherits the dust of the one before and decides what to build with it. Some build monuments, others build meaning, but all in their own way keep the flame moving forward. In that sense, the empire never ended at all. It simply changed shape, from stone to thought, from throne to memory. The city of God, wrote Augustine in the 5th century, is built not of marble, but of souls. Byzantium, more than any empire before or after, believed that. Its greatness lay not only in conquest or art, but in the quiet certainty that civilization was an act of worship, that to make something orderly, beautiful, or wise was to bring a fragment of heaven closer to earth. And that is what still lingers, like incense, long after the service is done. The echo of that belief can be heard wherever patience meets creation, in the slow restoration of a fresco, in the quiet discipline of a scientist working late, in the steady rhythm of someone preserving an old song, or teaching a forgotten language, or tending a garden planted centuries ago. All of them are, in their own way, Byzantines, caretakers of continuity, builders of the invisible. We keep the light not by guarding it, wrote a monk of Mount Athos, but by passing it on. Look around long enough, and you can see that light everywhere, in the domes of Florence and the cathedrals of Moscow, in the government buildings of Paris and Washington, with their Roman columns and marble steps, in the quiet order of the law, the symmetry of architecture, the elegance of letters, the reverence for the written word. And perhaps most of all, in the idea that history itself matters, that to remember is not to cling to the past, but to honor it. Because the greatest echo of the empire is not pride, it is gratitude. Gratitude that people once built things that still stand, that they thought deeply enough for us to still listen, that they dreamed of worlds where reason and beauty could live together, that they left us, in their ruins and words, a mirror through which to see ourselves. At sunset in Istanbul, when the city turns to gold, you can feel it, that soft, impossible continuity. The domes glow as they did 1,000 years ago. The call to prayer drifts across the water, the same cadence that once carried hymns. The ferries move slowly, their wakes curling like ink on the surface of the sea. And if you stand there, quietly, between Europe and Asia, you understand what the Byzantines always knew, that the divine hides in the in-between, between light and dark, old and new, memory and moment. The empire, said one chronicler, was a bridge between worlds, and it still is, for the bridge did not break. We walk it every day, every time we trace a thought back to its beginning, every time we choose harmony over noise, creation over forgetting. The empire lives on in us, not as rulers or subjects, but as keepers of the same simple vow. To remember that time passes, but meaning can stay. And that may be the most enduring echo of all. When the last emperor fell, the marble cracked, and the banners burned, it seemed that Rome's long dream had finally ended. But dreams are strange things. They sink beneath the surface, drift for centuries, then rise again when the world is ready to see them anew. The dream that had begun beside the Tiber and endured by the Bosporus returned quietly in the West, not as conquest, but as curiosity. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe awoke from the long dusk of the Middle Ages. Artists, scholars, and builders looked east and realized that something extraordinary had been preserved beyond their borders, something luminous and whole. They found it in the scrolls of Greek philosophers, the geometry of Byzantine architects, the gilded icons of Orthodox painters, the codes of Roman law, and the whispered idea that beauty itself was a form of knowledge. That awakening became the Renaissance, the rebirth not of empire, but of vision. "We do not rebuild Rome," wrote Leon Battista Alberti. "We remember her." And remembering her meant relearning how to think like her, how to see proportion in chaos, how to carve eternity from impermanence, how to build, not only with stone, but with harmony. In Florence, the domes of Brunelleschi rose like a rediscovered language, arches speaking the grammar of Byzantium. In Venice, mosaics gleamed in San Marco, the gold of Constantinople glowing under a different flag. In Rome itself, the artists of the Renaissance drew their lines from the same sacred geometry that had guided the builders of Hagia Sophia. Perspective, balance, symmetry, all of it was the empire reborn as art. It was a strange resurrection, secular yet reverent. God was still there, but so was man, restored to the center of the design. The human form became sacred again, not as an idol, but as reflection of divine order. And that belief, born from the same faith that had once filled Byzantium's domes, would carry civilization into new centuries. But the dream did not stop with art. From the Renaissance flowed the Enlightenment, a new age of reason, curiosity, and law. It was not the same faith that had moved Constantine or Justinian, but it was the same instinct, to find order in creation, to understand the rules of the universe, to replace superstition with structure. And in that pursuit of understanding, the echoes of empire resounded again. The philosophers of the 18th century, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Locke, quoted the Romans and the Byzantines as they wrote of justice, of balance, of governance bound by reason. They read Justinian's code and found in it the roots of modern civil law. They studied the decline of empires and saw in it a mirror of their own nations, a warning against excess, pride, and forgetting. They built new worlds not to escape the past, but to perfect it. "We have inherited their ruins," wrote Montesquieu, "but also their hope." From those ruins rose a new kind of empire, one not of emperors, but of ideas. Universities replaced palaces, libraries replaced legions. The printing press became the new army, carrying words instead of swords. Through these pages and presses, the dream spread again, across oceans this time. When explorers crossed into the unknown, they named their new cities with old names: New Rome, New York, Nova Lisboa. The empires of Europe carried both power and paradox, destruction and discovery, tyranny and art. And in their sails they carried, knowingly or not, the same dream of universality that had once driven Caesar's legions and Constantine's builders, the belief that the world could be ordered, mapped, and understood. Yet every echo grows softer with distance. By the 19th century, the dream had become a reflection once more. Europe looked at its colonies and saw not just triumph, but shadow. It began to realize that the empire, like any mirror, shows both beauty and distortion. And as the old powers began to fade, artists and philosophers turned their gaze inward, back toward the ruins, back toward the light that had first inspired them. Painters like Delacroix and Turner found holiness not in cathedrals, but in the play of light. Poets like Tennyson and Yeats wrote of fallen worlds and eternal returns. Historians like Edward Gibbon revisited Rome's decline and found in its story not despair, but dignity, the grace of endurance. "Empires fall," Gibbon wrote, "but their ruins are fertile ground." And indeed they are. Every decline becomes soil for something new. Every forgotten name becomes a foundation for another. Every fading empire leaves behind the tools for the next dreamer. By the 20th century, that dream had changed form again. The world had passed through wars that made ancient battles seem small. wars of machines and ideologies, fought not for cities, but for visions of what civilization itself should mean. Rome had sought glory. Byzantium had sought faith. The modern age sought peace, order, and knowledge. And even in those modern struggles, the same patterns appeared. The same questions the ancients had asked beneath their domes and arches. What does it mean to be civilized? What is power without justice? What is progress without a soul? The answers, then as now, were not simple. But they shared one truth, that the measure of greatness is not how high we climb, but what we preserve while climbing. Through all this, the dream of empire, the yearning for permanence, did not disappear. It evolved into something quieter, a collective longing for meaning in a world too large to hold. In art, in science, in philosophy, we still chase the same idea Byzantium carried through its long night, that knowledge can save, that beauty can heal, that the human spirit is worth the work of remembering. Even our modern cities bear the marks. Their skylines, glass instead of marble, still rise in symmetrical grace. Their governments echo the Senate and the Forum. Their laws, though written in new languages, still follow the rhythm of Justinian's logic. And their citizens, us, still seek the same calm certainty that someone, somewhere, has drawn a plan beneath the chaos. We build order to see ourselves, wrote the historian Burckhardt, and in that act, we become part of the same dream. And so, through all its transformations, the empire endures not as power, but as principle, the idea that humanity can shape its world toward harmony. That is the dream that returned, not the banners or crowns, but the quiet pursuit of balance. The belief that reason, art, and compassion together can outlast violence and pride. It is the dream we call civilization, the long thread that binds us to every age before us. Sometimes it hums through the world like a hidden chord. In the glow of a library at midnight, in the arches of a train station built with the same precision as a basilica, in the silence before a concert begins, in the shared awe of a spacecraft leaving Earth, its engineers tracing the same geometry once used to measure domes. We are still living inside that dream. We have simply changed its name. The empire returns not in walls, but in thought, wrote a scholar of Byzantium. It is the dream that never stops breathing. And perhaps that is the final grace of Rome's long story, that it was never only about dominion, but about imagination, the belief that human beings could take chaos and shape it into meaning. That dream, fragile and eternal, still passes through us. Every time we build, write, restore, study, or love something enough to want it to endure, we are part of that same inheritance. And so, the empire lives on, not in gold or in crowns, but in our hands, in our work, in our wonder. It lives in the quiet faith that time can be shaped, that beauty matters, and that even the smallest act of creation can echo through centuries. Dreams do not die, the Byzantines would have said. They wait to be remembered. Every story of Rome ends the same way, not with the clash of armies, but with a hush. Yet in that hush, something continues to hum, a resonance too deep to fade. Rome was never just a city, nor Byzantium only an empire. They were mirrors held up to humanity, showing us what we could build, what we could destroy, and what, if we were wise, we might preserve. And so when we speak of Rome, we are never only speaking of the past. We are speaking of the dream that has followed us ever since, the dream of order amid chaos, of light above ruin, of people, fragile and finite, trying to leave something beautiful behind. At the heart of that dream is endurance, not of walls, but of wonder. When the first Romans dug their huts into the Palatine Hill, they couldn't have known that their village would one day become the spine of the world. They couldn't have imagined aqueducts spanning valleys, armies carving borders, or faiths reshaping continents. They simply built, stone by stone, hour by hour, and in doing so, began a rhythm that history would never forget. That rhythm did not stop when the Western Empire fell, nor when Constantinople's last emperor vanished into the dust of 1453. It continued, quietly and visibly, through the voices of monks, artists, and dreamers. It continued in the patience of scribes, the order of law, the grace of domes, the logic of scholars. It continued in every hand that wrote and built and remembered. The empire dreamed through them, through us. What we build is never only for ourselves, wrote a Byzantine monk, but for those not yet born. That conviction, that beauty and knowledge are gifts meant to outlive their makers, is the deepest current of Rome's legacy. It turned marble into meaning and empire into memory. If you look closely, you can still see that dream rising again and again, like light through water. In the Renaissance, when painters brushed gold leaf over halos and called it rebirth. In the Enlightenment, when reason itself became a kind of sacred geometry. In the revolutions that built new republics upon Roman words, Senate, citizen, liberty, law. Even in the quiet of modern cities, where glass towers catch sunlight in the same way domes once caught prayer. Byzantium had learned the hardest lesson of all, how to endure without illusion. Where Rome had been conquered by force, Byzantium survived by memory. It learned to make stillness a strength, to find holiness in preservation. And that is perhaps the greatest dream of all, not the dream of triumph, but of continuity. The flame is not lost, said an old monk of Mount Athos. It only learns to burn quietly. Through centuries of twilight, that flame stayed alight, in the rhythm of chants, in the curves of arches, in the shimmer of mosaics. Every artist, every scholar, every believer who refused to let the past be forgotten became, in their own way, a keeper of that light. And now, the dream continues in forms its makers could never have imagined. It lives in satellites that trace silent roads above the earth, highways of data connecting continents that Rome and Byzantium could never have reached. It lives in the languages of law and science, still echoing the structure of Latin and Greek. It lives in the mathematics of architecture, in the symmetry of modern design, in every place where reason meets beauty. It lives in the simple act of learning, of remembering, of passing something onward. We are the Byzantines now, the stewards of inheritance. We live among their ruins and continuations, surrounded by the breath of their works. The empire dreamed, and the dream still dreams through us. If you wish to know what Rome was, wrote W.H. Auden, look around you. She is the world we live in. Indeed she is. Every parliament, every library, every law, every bridge and word and melody that seeks order, all are her children. Her columns have become circuits, her roads digital pathways, her senate our councils, her faith our curiosity. The form changes, the rhythm remains. We still seek balance, we still build for beauty, we still try to give chaos a name, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Not empire as dominion, but empire as dream, a dream of meaning. A belief that human hands can shape time into something worth remembering. Because the Romans, for all their might, knew they would one day fall. The Byzantines, for all their endurance, knew they could not last forever. Yet both believed that civilization, even in its most fragile moments, was sacred work. Every stone, every code, every melody was a prayer in disguise, a way of saying, we were here. We tried to make sense of the world, and we who walk among their echoes are still saying the same. There is a strange peace in that continuity. Empires fade, but their patterns remain, softer now, like music heard through water. The same refrain repeats, that the light of thought once kindled can travel across ages without losing its warmth. That is what connects us, not blood, not flag, but memory. The long, unbroken memory of people who believed that beauty and wisdom were worth the labor of a lifetime. It's the calm between wars, the order beneath chaos, the silence inside progress. And when we stand before old stones in Rome or Ravenna or Istanbul, we can still feel it. A heartbeat too steady to be dead. Listen, the walls seem to whisper. We are not gone, we are only resting. At dusk in Istanbul, the light turns honey gold, then silver, then blue. The domes gleam, the water breathes, and the air fills with echoes, bells and birds and voices that sound both ancient and new. The city glows like memory itself, half asleep, half awake, eternal. Stand there long enough and time begins to fold. Rome becomes Constantinople. Constantinople becomes Istanbul. And Istanbul becomes simply the city. The idea of all cities, the dream of order and light that began beside the Tiber and still hums beside the sea. And in that stillness one understands, the empire never truly fell. It became the world. The dream of empire, wrote a modern historian, was the dream of meaning itself. And maybe that is why it still feels alive, because what we seek is not power, but purpose. To build something worth remembering. To live as though what we create might endure. To leave behind more light than we found. That is what Rome began. That is what Byzantium preserved. And that is what we, in our quiet age of glass and light, still try to continue. The empire dreamed, and in dreaming, taught us how to hope. You've been listening to Calm History, the Roman series, Episode 8, The Empire That Outlived Rome. Tonight, we've wandered through the long afterglow of empire, from Constantine's golden city to the quiet reflections of the modern age. Through decline and endurance, faith and reason, Byzantium showed the world how to survive by remembering. But this isn't the end of Rome's story. It's the threshold of a new world, where old knowledge becomes new light. In the next episode, we'll follow that light westward and northward into Renaissance Italy, the Christian kingdoms, and the rebirth of human curiosity. For now, let your thoughts drift like candlelight over water. The empire sleeps, but its dream continues.